Yeah, we're going to hit Exodus 11 and 12 today. And since we're doing it that way, we're going to hit the final plague and the Passover. And we will return later, in the course of going through Exodus, to Exodus 12. We'll return to the Passover for some other reasons. But again, just for the sake of accounting for our episodes here, Exodus 11 and 12 is going to be our focus today. And we'll hit the final plague and the Passover. So what I want to do is I'm going to just start off by reading the first 7 verses. Well, let's make it the first 10 verses, because it's sort of a quick problem, but there is sort of a setting problem that some people would take as an apparent contradiction in these verses. So I want to get that out of the way before we kind of get into the nuts and bolts of the plague and the Passover. So in Exodus 11, again, I'm reading from the ESV, we read this. The Lord said to Moses, "Yet one plague more I will bring upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterward, he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will drive you away completely. Speak now in the hearing of the people, that they ask every man of his neighbor and every woman of her neighbor for silver and gold jewelry. The Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants and in the sight of the people. So Moses said, Thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out in the midst of Egypt, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. From the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle. There shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there has never been, nor ever will be again. But not a dog shall growl against any of the people of Israel, either man or beast, that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel." Let me see here. Do I want to read? Yeah, I'll tack on verses 8 and 9 here. "And all these your servants shall come down to me and bow down to me, saying, Get out, you and all the people who follow you. And after that I will go out. And he went out from Pharaoh in hot anger. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will not listen to you, that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt." Now you say, well, what's the issue here? If you go back to verse 2, where God is talking to Moses in verse 1, and God says to Moses, "Speak now in the hearing of the people." That creates the impression, especially when you get this little parenthetical thought in verse 3 about how the Lord gave the Israelites favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and Moses was great in the land of Egypt, and Pharaoh's servants, and all the people sort of looked at him, and were impressed, so on and so forth. It makes it sound like Moses is now standing before like a crowd or something, and this is a big public announcement about what's going to happen. But that isn't the case. If you look at verses 8, 9, and 10, it's very clear that Moses is speaking to Pharaoh still. When it says in verse 8, all these your servants, he's speaking to Pharaoh, shall come down to me and bow to me. Get out, get out of here. And then at the end of verse 8, and Moses, went out from Pharaoh in hot anger. So he's still in front of Pharaoh. And the prior chapter 10, sounded like Moses had already left. Remember, the chapter ended, then Pharaoh said to him, "Get away from me, take care to never see my face again. For on the day you see my face, you shall die." And Moses said, "As you say, I will not see your face again." So it sounds like he leaves, and it sounds like we have this interlude with Moses in front of the people. Again, he's speaking to the people, but then it turns around in verses 8, 9, and 10, and it's very transparent again that he's still with Pharaoh. The chapter 11 ends, Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. He did not let the people of Israel go out of his land. So it just seems like the author and or editor of the text here can't make up his mind as to where Moses is at. It's really not that big of an issue, because it's all resolved if you take the first verb of chapter 11. Okay, chapter 11, verse 1. Instead of saying the Lord said to Moses, you could, again, say the Lord had said to Moses. That's a perfectly legitimate translation. And so this backgrounding information, or the first few verses are backgrounding. It's not like Moses is somewhere else and then he has to come back to Pharaoh after he's just left and all that sort of stuff. So I want to make a comment on that. Again, this is easily rectifiable just by going from a past tense to a past perfect sense. And the Hebrew form of the verb allows you to do that. It's perfectly legitimate grammatically. It's not a forced sort of translation. So again, you might run into this somewhere that look at how the text is a mess here, and the guy can't make up his mind where Moses is. Again, that's a fabricated problem. So I wanted to mention that before we move on. What we really want to focus on, again, is what happens with the death of the firstborn and, of course, the Passover. And so we just read through the 10 verses of chapter 11, gives us the setting, and we get right into chapter 12, and we start off with the commentary, the explanation of the origin story, if you will, of Passover. And then we're going to hit the final plague and then a few more thoughts on Passover anyway. So I'm going to read Exodus 12, just so that we have this in our head, the first 17 verses, and then I'm going to skip to verses 43 through 51, because that also deals with the Passover as an institution. So beginning in verse 12, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons. According to what each can eat, you shall make your account for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. And you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on fire. With unleavened bread and bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted, its head with its legs and its inner parts. And you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. As a statute forever you shall keep it as a feast. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven out of your houses. For if anyone eats what is leavened from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day you shall hold a holy assembly, and on the seventh day a holy assembly. No work shall be done on those days. But what everyone needs to eat, that alone may be prepared by you. And you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this very day I brought your host out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a statute forever. And that's the first 17 verses. And when we get down to verse 43, it sort of picks up on that. We have the death of the firstborn as the interlude. And so in verse 43 we read, And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, This is the statute of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it, but every slave that is bought for money may eat of it after you have circumcised it. No foreigner or hired worker may eat of it. And it shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the flesh outside the house, and you shall not break any of its bones. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. If a stranger shall sojourn with you and would keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. Then he may come near and keep it. He shall be as a native of the land, but no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. There shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you. And all the people of Israel did as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, and on that very day the Lord brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts, or with their hosts. You could translate that. So that's the bulk of Exodus chapter 12. And again, we'll pick up with the death of the firstborn in a moment. But I want to make a few observations about Passover as an institution, because again, we will be returning to this when we hit Exodus 23 especially. So the first point, as far as observations go, is you'll notice as we read that, there was in Exodus this connection or merging of the Passover feast, and it is called a feast, and at least in a handful of passages in the Old Testament, a chag is the word for feast or festival. There's a merger of that with this feast of unleavened bread. And I say merger because there are other parts of Scripture where these two things are separate. And so there's a whole issue here of how the Passover and its rules, its observance, how it relates to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Why is it separate in some passages? Why is it together in others? And also in relation to the other feasts. But the big one here is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And when we get to Exodus 23, we're going to talk about that in a bit more detail. It's really odd as well to point out that Passover is not mentioned in the entire book of Exodus other than this chapter. The feasts of Exodus 23 are therefore regarded by scholars as pre-Passover, the stuff that was around Israel culturally prior to Passover. I'm going to repeat that. And this is just to telegraph the kind of thing we're going to be talking about when we hit Exodus 23. This is the only chapter where Passover is talked about in Exodus. Whereas in Exodus 23, you get sort of the holy festival calendar of the nation. And it doesn't talk about Passover. It talks about these other feasts. And one of those other feasts is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which if you go back to Exodus 12, somehow gets aligned with Passover. So there's this big academic discussion that relates, as you can imagine. We've talked about this kind of thing many times on the podcast, and specifically with Exodus. It gets into the issue of when was Exodus written, or what parts of Exodus, when were they written, to sort of order or reorder what's going on in the calendar, the festival calendar in ancient Israel. So again, I want to sort of set it up because this is why, when scholars have these discussions, the impression that we get a lot of times is that you got a bunch of guys, sitting in a smoke-filled room, and they're like, oh, what can we say to people that will, the stuff they haven't heard in church that'll bother them a little bit, we'll get a kick out of that. Let's just sort of make something up to rattle their cages. Well, okay, that occasionally happens. I have to own that because I've seen that happen. But most of the time, it's just stuff like what I just described. There are just oddities or features of the biblical text that you kind of don't see unless you're intentionally like trying to be alert for these things. And so people have noticed, why isn't Passover lumped in with this other stuff later? Because we have it first here in Exodus 12. And when you get to 20, why does the book do this stuff? Why does the writer do this? And that becomes part of this matrix, this whole discussion about the authorship and the editorial hands, the editorial intention behind the book of Exodus or behind the Torah, more widely. So the issues aren't contrived. I mean, the text itself produces real questions. And the issue is, well, what kind of answers do you come up with that make any sense? Are you just throwing something out there and then arguing in a circle to prove your little hypothesis, or does what you're saying actually make some sense? Now, Carpenter, has a little bit of a comment here. And again, I don't want to get too far into these weeds, but when we talk in Exodus 23, when we get there about the festival calendar and all that stuff, we'll get into calendar issues more. But you can already see in Exodus 12, in relation to Passover, just the second verse, this month shall be for you the beginning of months, like the beginning of the year. Well, Israel already had a calendar before this. They're like any other ancient, we know this from various passages. We know it just by having our heads screwed on correctly. Every culture is going to have a calendar, and it's going to be an agricultural calendar. There's going to be a time of the year when you plant. There's going to be a time of the year when you harvest, and all this kind of stuff. Your year is arranged in an agricultural society by what you eat, what you harvest, what you eat, what you plant, all that kind of stuff. And they're already doing things like observing the cycles of the moon and the sun and all that kind of stuff. So Israel already had a calendar, but the beginning of the calendar which, in ancient inscriptions. Okay, let's just take the Gezer calendar. And if you're an academic listening to this, I know that the Gezer calendar might not be epigraphic Hebrew. I get that. It might be Phoenician. It's indeterminate. So be it. But that's not the only sort of place where you get indications that ancient Israel, had an agricultural calendar. You get that in the biblical text as well. But the Gezer calendar is kind of a neat illustration because it's a calendar. It's arranged, this way. So what about this changing of the calendar here? This is at the heart. These first few verses of Exodus 12 are at the heart of the whole topic or discussion. And some of you who are like into calendars and chronology, you'll be aware of this already. That and even if you pay attention to modern Judaism, you'll discover this, that Israel had more than one calendar. And this passage is in part why. They already had an existing agricultural calendar with its month names. Now they get a different calendar because they're being reborn as a nation. And Passover is going to mark the birth, hence the new year, of this particular calendar now. They never dispense with the old one. They just adopt the new one, and you have this interplay between these different calendars. Again, you're already going to be somewhat aware of that. But let me read what Carpenter's little summary here, without getting too deeply into the woods here. Carpenter writes, in order to celebrate her birth with proper recognition, Yahweh changes Israel's calendar. The beginning of the year is the day they came forth from Egypt. This was a new time of creation. Again, that's kind of obvious as to why this would happen at this point. We continue with Carpenter here. The months shall now be remembered, beginning with the month of the Exodus, from a definite time in history, not from a distant primordial or mythical past. The name of the month used here, Abiv, means fresh ears of grain, and is equivalent to March or April. And Carpenter references Exodus 13:4 for that. Today in the month of Abib you are going out, and 9:31, the flax and barley were struck down, for the barley was in the ear, the flax was in the bud, so on and so forth. The name was changed later to Nisan, and this actually happens in the biblical record. This is Nehemiah 2:1. The month of Nisan, the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, so on and so forth. And again, if you read through Nehemiah, you'll find out that this month name, Nisan, corresponds to this Abib, earlier in Israel's history. The name was changed later to Nisan when Israel borrowed that name from the Babylonian calendar during the exile. Of course, Nehemiah is writing after the exile, so this is something that's already in Israelite culture. It appears that Exodus 23:16b and Exodus 34:22b record a time in the fall for the end of the agricultural year, and so possibly the beginning of a new year. But the basis for the spring festival of Passover and these fall observances is entirely different in Exodus. The solution to the seeming fall, spring, New Years, plural, has not been fully solved, but it is plausibly suggested that there were two New Years in Israel, one in the fall and one in the spring. One in the spring being tied to the religious calendar, and one in the fall to the agricultural calendar. And he references Sarna's commentary there. Now, again, you just have this going on both in the Hebrew Bible and, again, just in the history of Israel. And Exodus 12 is, part of that whole set of circumstances. So I don't want to get, too far into the weeds about, Israel's calendar and whatnot, which calendar should be used, because I get these emails. I got one actually providentially, two days ago, about which calendar should we be using, Mike? Which calendar is the sacred one? Is it is it the calendar that the Qumran people used? Is it this calendar or that other calendar? Because we know like the Pharisees' calendar came from the Babylonians and it's pagan. Well, that's actually not true. I mean, Israel had a calendar already in place that wasn't the one used at Qumran, and that wasn't even one of the two found in Scripture. It wasn't pagan. It was already in place. Now, the pagan idea comes from the adaptation of Babylonian names for the months of the calendar, but that was something that happened during the exile when the Israelite, the Jewish, as they're going to be referred to then, when the southern tribes are in Babylon for the exile, they're going to appropriate those month names for their own calendar. So that doesn't mean the calendar was pagan. It just means they changed month names. That's all they did. And the Hebrew Bible, again, is going to show evidence of this and incorporate these sorts of things. And by the way, again, without getting into the weeds, the Qumran calendar was not an astronomical calendar. These other ones are, one of them at least, is sort of rooted to astronomy. If you're going to lump in the seasons there, it's an agricultural calendar that's going to coincide with certain months, certain events like the solstices and whatnot. So it has astronomical elements. That's a solar elements there. You also have lunar elements in the Israelite calendar because of the cycles. The moon, basically 30 days, which is a month, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, none of this is pagan. The news flash here is that people living everywhere, whether it's Israel or Egypt or Babylon or wherever, they're all looking at the same moon. They're all looking at the same sun. This is how you mark time in the ancient world. It's a calendar built out of observed phenomena, and everybody's looking at the same thing. So I think we need to sort of dispense with this. One calendar's pagan, another one's not. That doesn't work real well. And the Qumran calendar basically ignored astronomy in favor of mathematical precision. And they had some very intentional things that they did to produce that calendar. But again, we're getting a little too far in the weeds here. I just wanted to bring this up because it becomes an issue for some, and I think we don't need to really get too distracted by what's happening here. Now, we will also in the future get into the differences between the rules for Passover here in Exodus 12 and the rules for Passover in Deuteronomy 16. They are not the same. In fact, there are points that they are 180 degrees opposed to each other. And there are circumstances as to why that is. I'm going to read a very brief paragraph here from Jeff Tigay in his Deuteronomy commentary, the Jewish Publication Society commentary. He writes, the difference between Exodus and Deuteronomy may be due to the fact that the original Pesach, Passover in Exodus, was offered by individual households. Okay, well, we just read that. You observe Passover in your house, for which even a single head of small cattle might have been too much to consume. Whereas Deuteronomy deals with a time when the sacrifice would be made at the central sanctuary, and many households could share a larger animal. Specifically in Deuteronomy, you're told not to eat it in your house. It's just completely opposite. Another possibility is that the Pesach offering originated at a time when the Israelites owned primarily sheep and goats, and that Deuteronomy reflects later conditions when large cattle had also become important in their economy. That's the end of Tigay's quote. Now, all that's true, but Tigay and others are going to go on from that, and they're going to say, hey, part of the picture here is because Deuteronomy is late. Moses didn't write it. It wasn't written during the Mosaic period. It's written later when Israel was in the land and they had a temple, and that's the whole idea of the central sanctuary. So the rules change. Because if you remember, just as we read in Exodus 12, you have the observance of the Passover, then you got the Feast of Unleavened Bread, you've got solemn assemblies being observed. Well, you don't really go into your house and have a solemn assembly there. The solemn assembly is a public event. Again, when we get into this material, it's like, well, where's the solemn assembly? Is it at the temple complex, or do they already go home and then they have one in their towns? How does this work? Because the rules for Passover and its observance, the whole festival time, are different in these two chapters. So when we get to some of that later with the calendar stuff, we'll get into the weeds a little bit here, but right now I think it's basically a distraction. So for our purposes, the rest of the time here, we want to get into the meaning of Passover. This will be sort of the second observation that I make about Passover. And I have a couple more observations, this one and another one about Passover, and then the death of the firstborn. So that's where we'll focus the rest of the time here. Now, the meaning of the Passover. First thing I want to say here is the Passover is clearly substitutionary. It just is. In other words, the Passover lamb takes the place of people, takes the place of the people. Hence, its blood is a protection. Its life, the lamb's life, is taken in the place of people. All right? Exodus 12, 23 through 27. Okay? For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians. And when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your houses to strike you. You shall observe this rite as a statute for you and your sons forever. And when you come to the land that the Lord will give you as he has promised, you shall keep this service. And when your children say to you, what do you mean by this service? You shall say, it is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover. For he passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians, but spared our houses. Okay? It's very clearly substitutionary. And furthermore, the verb used in Exodus 12 to describe the ritual, the noun is Pesach, Passover. The verb is Pasach, okay? That is not the normative word for the act of like passing over something or passing by. That's a different verb. It's avar. Tigay, again, says a little something about this as well that I think is worth citing. He, on his note on the Passover sacrifice, he writes, or you could translate this, protective sacrifice. So he actually likes the word protective instead of just pass over, because, again, the verb used here in this chapter is not the normal verb for passing over something or passing through something. It actually, the noun is going to be used for protection elsewhere. So back to Tigay. He says, protective sacrifice. This sacrifice, called Pesach in Hebrew, reenacts the original Pesach sacrifice. Again, remember, Tigay's writing about Deuteronomy, so that's where he's getting this reenactment thing. This sacrifice, called Pesach in Hebrew, reenacts the original Pesach sacrifice that the Israelites performed on the eve of the Exodus, right before the last of the 10 plagues. The name is derived from the verb Pasach, which describes the manner in which God spared the firstborn in the houses of Israel after they smeared the blood of the sacrifice on their doorposts and lintels. In Exodus 12:13, 12:23, 12:27. The Vulgate, that's the Latin translation of the Bible. The Vulgate translates the verb as the Lord passed over. And the Vulgate also translates the name of the sacrifice as Passover. Let me stop there. So this is where we get Passover language from the Latin Vulgate, which was, that's 5th century AD. This is why, in the early church, this is the time of the early church, after the church becomes legal in the Roman Empire, okay, this language in this passage just became institutionalized, Passover. And so Tigay is saying, we kind of missed something by that language, which comes from the Vulgate. So back to Tigay, he says, the Hebrew verb, however, does not mean pass over. Most of the ancient translations, older than the Vulgate, those translations, like Syriac, Septuagint, all that kind of stuff. Most of the ancient translations and commentaries render the verb as the Lord spared, okay, or the Lord had compassion, or the Lord protected. And the name of the sacrifice is protective sacrifice, referring to the protection of Israel during the final plague. This rendering, says Tigay, is supported by the way the verb is used in Isaiah 31, verse 5. Let me just read that to you. Like birds hovering, so the Lord of hosts will protect Jerusalem. He will protect and deliver it. Again, the language of protection there, the second one, he will protect and deliver it. The word there, we get this sense of clear protection. He will spare and rescue it. Okay, so you've got two verbs for protect, and then you've got spare, and that's pasak, and then rescue is another verb for to deliver or rescue. Specifically, that one is malat, and the earlier two references are nagan. So you've got 4 verbs there. 3 of them are very clearly about protection and rescuing, and then you've got pasak right in the middle of that. And Isaiah 31 translates it spare. He will spare Jerusalem and rescue it. So I think Tigay's observation is really important here. We get this language from the Latin Vulgate, this Passover, and it's not like it's terrible, but it's a bit misleading because we sort of are led to miss the protective element. So now the point of sparing, let me just throw something else in here. let me throw in another resource. D.J.A. Klein's, in his Dictionary of Classical Hebrew, notes the sparing, again, the protection semantic of this particular Hebrew verb lemma. For those of you who are into Hebrew, DCH, Dictionary of Classical Hebrew, is a different set. That's a different scholarly lexicon than Halot, Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament. DCH by Klein's is more recent. It's multi-volume. It may at some point replace Halot. Who knows? But the neat thing about it is it incorporates Dead Sea Scroll material for its semantic ranges, as far as word meanings go. But Klein's, again, takes this trajectory as well. In his entry, he has Pesach, or Pasak, the verb form specifically, as a homograph. Now, what that means is if you actually look up in a Greek or Hebrew lexicon, or Greek to English, Hebrew to English dictionary, there will be entries that have numbers, like Pasak 1, Pasak 2, Pasak 3. All of the good lexicons do this because Hebrew is like English. It has homographs. It has words that are entirely distinct from each other that are spelled the same way. Okay, that's what a homograph is. And Pasak is one of these. It's a homograph. And one particular homograph is about protection. It's about sparing. It's about, again, this has this substitutionary semantic to it. So Klein's actually lists the Exodus 12 occurrences of this verb in the entry under his Pasak number 3, to protect. So he doesn't view it as passing over anything because, like Tige, he knows that this is not your normative verb for passing over or passing by. It specifically has something to do with protecting, sparing something. And in this case, the lamb becomes a substitutionary element. The lamb's life is taken in exchange for the people who are protected in this ritual. And why do I bring this up? Well, you probably already know. Since Paul explicitly refers to Jesus explicitly as our Passover lamb, that's 1 Corinthians 5:7, pulls no punches here. Cleanse out the old leaven that you may be a new lump as you really are unleavened for Christ. Our Passover lamb has been sacrificed. So since Paul does this, he explicitly identifies Jesus with the Passover lamb, and that his death, obviously the death of Jesus, was sacrificial. Jesus, as the thing sacrificed, aligns well with the Passover lamb because the Passover lamb had to be unblemished. And of course, Jesus was unblemished. Okay, because of the typology of the Passover lamb, its nature as a substitution, it's really flawed to argue that the death of Jesus was not substitutionary. And this comes up all the time in these rabbit trail discussions on the atonement. Look, folks, it has to be substitutionary if it's going to be a typological fulfillment of the Passover lamb. And that point is explicitly made in the New Testament. Whether it offends you or not isn't the issue. It's in the text. Okay, now that isn't to say that the sacrifice of Jesus doesn't have other semantics that go with it, other sorts of meanings, other aspects to the atonement. It does. The atonement, the work of Christ, does have other aspects of meaning, other ways you can talk about the atonement. So I'm not arguing that that's not legitimate. It is. What's not legitimate is to argue that in the process of highlighting these other aspects of the atonement, it's hermeneutically flawed to conclude that the substitutionary element isn't there. It is, explicitly. And it has to be because of the typology with the Passover lamb. John 19:36, does sort of what Paul's doing in 1 Corinthians 5:7. John 19:36 says, "For these things took place, the scriptures might be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken." Okay, well, where does that come from? Not one of his bones will be broken. Guess where it comes from? Exodus 12:46, Passover lamb, quote, "It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the flesh outside the house. You shall not break any of its bones." And Numbers 9:12, also speaking of the Passover. "They shall leave none of it until the morning, nor break any of its bones. According to all the statute for the Passover, they shall keep it." Okay, John does it. John connects the sacrifice of Jesus with the Passover lamb. So does Paul. Okay, it is very obviously substitutionary. So yes, you know me by now, if you've listened to Q&As, I'm all in favor of the idea that the atonement should be looked at in a multitude of ways. But what typically happens is, while people love to look at it in alternate ways just so that they can deny substitution. Okay, that is wrong-headed and it's hermeneutically flawed. You basically have to pretend that these passages aren't here, that the writers are not trying to strike the analogy when they explicitly do. So the connection is important. The connection between Jesus, his body and his blood given sacrificially, in between, there with the connections with the Last Supper. This is what you have going. And obviously this is part, this whole Last Supper thing. There's a big question: was the Last Supper a Passover meal? Now, there's a lot that can be said in favor of that. It's not without controversy. It's a hotly debated item. So for those of you who are interested in the defense of the idea of the Passover, or the Last Supper being a Passover meal, I've uploaded to the protected folder an article by Robin Rutledge. It's called Passover and the Last Supper. It's from Tyndale Bulletin, volume 53, number 2, 2002, pages 203 to 221. You can read it there. But I just want to read the abstract and a little bit of a section to you, because I do think that the Last Supper, it either was a Passover meal or was intentionally connected with the Passover. And that would make sense because of what John says about the death of Jesus, the person, not bone, not broken, and what Paul says more explicitly. Jesus is our Passover lamb. So from Rutledge's article, here's the abstract. The Synoptic Gospels present the Last Supper as a Passover meal. Whether this coincided with the actual Passover or, as some suggest, was held a day early, it was viewed by the participants as a Passover meal. And the words and actions of Jesus, including the institution of the Lord's Supper, would have been understood within that context. In order to better appreciate the significance of what happened at the Last Supper, This article looks at the form that the Passover celebration is likely to have had taken at the time of Jesus, okay, and notes links with the meal Jesus shared with his disciples. Now, that's the end of the abstract, but look, the rules for the Passover changed from Exodus to Deuteronomy, and they evolved further in Judaism. So if you're going to try to disconnect the Passover and the Lord's Supper based on Exodus and Deuteronomy, it's not quite a great strategy. What you really need to do is you need to look at how the Passover was observed in the first century. And this is what Routledge is going to do in I don't know if it's a man or a woman here writing, because Robin can be neutral. But that's what's going to happen in this article. So if you're interested in this, I invite you to read it. And the one section, section 2, I'll just read from this as well, was the Last Supper a Passover meal. Just this will give you a flavor to the issues that the article covers. He or she writes, this is a thorny question, was the Last Supper a Passover meal, that has been the subject of many studies. The Synoptic Gospels indicate that the meal that Jesus shared with his disciples on the night before his arrest was a Passover meal. It is suggested that the fourth Gospel, wanting to emphasize the identification of Jesus with the Passover sacrifice, places the crucifixion a day earlier than the other Gospels, at the time the Passover lambs were being sacrificed in the temple. One approach to this difficulty is to accept that the accounts cannot be reconciled and to choose between them. The traditional view is that the Synoptic Gospels paint the more accurate picture historically, whilst the fourth Gospel focuses on theological symbolism and has adapted the chronology in order to place the death of Jesus at the time of the temple sacrifices. More recent scholarly opinion has tended to favor John's chronology and views references to the Passover in the Synoptics as later additions by the early church, which had come to interpret the Lord's Supper as a Christian Passover. Attempts to harmonize the Gospel accounts include suggestions that the Last Supper may have been some other kind of fellowship meal, maybe eaten in anticipation of the Passover, or that Jesus and his disciples celebrated the Passover according to a variant calendar, which is interesting in and of itself. If so, they may have eaten the meal early, though probably without a lamb. This seems unlikely in the light of Jesus' request for a place to eat the Passover, though. Few who support John's chronology would doubt that the similar expression in John 18:28 refers to a meal which included the Passover lamb. So why would the same not apply to the Synoptics? Of course, it could be argued that if the expression refers to the Passover meal in the Synoptics, it is reasonable to suppose that it also refers to the Passover meal in John. It is possible, though, that John, in the interest of theological symbolism, used the term Pascha, that's the Greek equivalent of Pesach, more loosely to refer to one of the other sacrifices offered during the Passover week. The lack of clear evidence means that we cannot be sure about the chronology. In my view, this is the writer, the author, Routledge. In my view, it is more likely that the Last Supper was a true Passover meal, and the following outline will be based on that assumption. However, even if the Last Supper was eaten the day before Passover, the language of the Synoptic Gospels indicates that Jesus and his disciples celebrated it as a Passover meal. The only difference then would have been the absence of the lamb, and since this does not figure in the symbolism of the meal, the substance of what follows still stands. Of course, that's the end of the Routledge material. Of course, it is interesting, in the absence of the lamb, we have Jesus present. And it's a foreshadowing of his death as the Passover, as Paul would say, our Passover lamb. So it's an interesting article for those of you who are really into this kind of synoptic stuff and the chronology stuff. That probably whets your appetite. But if you subscribe to the newsletter, you can get the article through the archive. It's at the bottom of every issue of the newsletter. A link to the protected folder where you can get some of this material. But let's just put it this way: going with Routledge's last paragraph there, whether it was the Passover meal or a meal associated with the Passover celebration in some way in the first century, who cares? The issue is that the association is there in the Synoptic Gospels and John. They associate the death of Jesus with the Passover celebration. And that makes complete sense in light of what John says in John 19:36 about not breaking the bones. And it makes complete sense that Paul looked at it that way very explicitly in 1 Corinthians 5. And for us, we do the scripture harm if we deny that the death of Jesus, at least one role that it has, one meaning that it has, is substitutionary atonement. It very plainly is. It cannot align with the typology of the purpose of Passover, the Passover lamb, and not have that point. So again, I thought that was important and worth covering. Again, I'm a big tent guy when it comes to atonement discussion. I think the atonement can be looked at from a variety of aspects that are legitimate, but it is not legitimate to use that discussion to exclude and eliminate substitution. So there you have it. Third observation, Passover's connection to the last plague, the death of the firstborn. And I'm going to read Exodus 12, and 13 again. So, we talked about Passover. Let's get into the final plague here. And we'll address this like we've addressed the other plagues at some point here in a moment. But Exodus 12 to 13 says this: "For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pasach. I will pass over you, or more accurately, I will protect you. I will spare you. And no plague shall befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." Now that it goes on, the 10th and final plague is described in detail in a few verses, Exodus 12, 29 through 32. So let's just read those. "At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, 'Up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. He wants them to intercede because he's done now. He's giving up. Now, this last plague, like the other ones, again, fits very nicely into the perspective of decreation. Again, Yahweh's mastery and control over creation order, as opposed to the fecklessness of Pharaoh and his magicians, his Khartoumim, and his the gods of Egypt. It fits into, again, decreation, the overturning of Ma'at, the cosmic creation order. So it overturns that. There's a decreation element. It demolishes the sense, the belief, the hope that Pharaoh and Egypt's gods can control the world order, the cosmic balance. It attacks that again, and by virtue of that, it is a polemic against Egyptian religion, Egyptian theology, what they believe about Pharaoh as a god and their gods. So the application in this instance is pretty simple, actually. The final plague was transparently directed against pharaonic succession. Okay, his firstborn dies. Now, the gods had set up Ma'at, and it was supposed to be transferred from one incarnation of Horus, i.e. the Pharaoh, to the next, an unending, unbroken stream. If you recall from earlier episodes, when there was succession, when a Pharaoh was dying or dead, it was a very serious thing. The succession had to be orderly and according to plan, according to Ma'at, according to the will of the Egyptian gods, so that the balance of creation, the heavens and the earth, all of that would be maintained, and things would go on as usual. You would prevent the eruption of chaos in the land. Well, that's pretty much trashed in the final plague, because the God of Israel steps in and says, "We'll show you who has power over the cosmic balance, the control of heaven and earth here, the life cycles. We'll show you who has control over order and chaos right here." He takes away the succession. The firstborn dies. This would be the son who was supposed to inherit the throne. The gods had set this up. They instituted Pharaoh as the incarnation of Horus, the son of Ra, to maintain divinely ordered Ma'at. The plan was supposed to be unending, transitioning from one Pharaoh to the next through his firstborn son. So this amounts to a supernatural assault on Pharaoh's firstborn, and a supernatural assault on the whole concept of Ma'at, Pharaoh as the one who maintains order, who acquiesces to the gods, who through ritual keeps his commitment to the gods, and they will keep their commitment to Ma'at as well. This symbiotic, thing that just is supposed to go on and on. No bumps in the road. Well, this is a huge bump in the road. It upends the whole idea. All of this cosmic order, cosmic balance, is not in the control of Pharaoh and his magicians and their gods. This power is located really firmly in the hand of someone else, and that is the God of the Hebrews. And basically, the Egyptians are at his mercy. And Pharaoh wants closure. He wants Moses and Aaron to bless him as he lets the people go, because he knows he has no control over this situation. He's done. He's a broken man. He's a broken deity, and so are the rest of his gods, because they can't intervene either. There's no ambiguity left in this picture. And so that's what he wants to know. Once I let these people go, things will return to normal. That the God of the Hebrews has been appeased. And we're done with all this. So it's again another assault on Egyptian religion. Now, before we leave this episode, before we wrap it up, I want to say a little bit about the destroying agent used by God in the last plague. And when you consider the terminology of the destruction of the firstborn in the wider Old Testament backdrop, believe it or not, the language loops in the angel of Yahweh, loops the angel of Yahweh into the scene, and in so doing creates yet another identification of the angel as Yahweh. Specifically, the verb used in these descriptions is shachat, to destroy, and the noun is mashkit. They share the same Hebrew root, the sh, the ch, and the t. This verb and this noun, again, there's a commonality there. And this terminology does get used of the angel of Yahweh. So I'm going to read a little bit from my angel's book. Again, for those who haven't read it, this will just give you a sampling, but it's relevant here. So it's not just a commercial. But from my angel's book specifically, this is pages 65 up to the top of page 68. I wrote this: the characterization of the angel of Yahweh as a destroyer, mashkit, in 1 Chronicles 21:16. Remember, this is the judgment on David with the census and all that. The angel of Yahweh is called a mashkit there. That characterization has ramifications for identifying another mysterious angel figure in the Old Testament. So I'm going to read 1 Chronicles 21:15 and 16, just to give the flavor here. God sent the angel to Jerusalem to destroy, shachat, to destroy it. But as he was about to destroy it, shachat, there's the verb again, the Lord saw, and he relented from the calamity. And he said to the angel who was working destruction, mashkit, it is enough. Now stay your hand. And the angel of the Lord was standing by the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, and David lifted his eyes and saw the angel of the Lord standing between heaven and earth, and in his hand a drawn sword stretched out over Jerusalem. Again, the angel with the drawn sword in his hand, it occurs 3 times in the entire Hebrew Bible. Here, Joshua 5, okay, the captain of the Lord's host, the commander of the hosts of the Lord. And then in Numbers 22, the Balaam incident, where it's the angel of the Lord, explicitly. So we know who this figure is. If you've not read Unseen Realm, you're just going to have to catch up that way. This is God as man in the Old Testament. It's very significant language. It's not the only way that idea is expressed. You have the word, you have the name. Okay, you've got all this terminology going on in the Old Testament. But this is an important one. So not surprisingly, I wrote in the angel's book, the parallel passage in 2 Samuel, parallel to this punishment of David, uses the same terminology and forms. Let's read that, 2 Samuel 24, 16, 17. When the angel stretched out his hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it, shachat, the Lord relented from the calamity and said to the angel who was working destruction, said to the mashkit, among the people, it is enough, now stay your hand. And the angel of the Lord was by the threshing floor of Arona the Jebusite. Then David spoke to the Lord when he saw the angel who was striking the people. Now it's clear from both passages that the angel of Yahweh is in view and that he brings mashkit, destruction. Interestingly, this is the identical term used to describe the angel of death in the account of the death of the firstborn on the eve of the first Passover. I'll read the passage again. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over, I will protect or spare you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you, mashkit, to mashkit you, when I strike the land of Egypt. Then Moses called all the elders of Israel and said to them, go and select the lambs for yourselves according to your clans and kill the Passover lamb. For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer, the mashkit, to enter your houses to strike you. It's Exodus 12, 13, 21, and 23. The mashkit, who was the angel of Yahweh in 1 Chronicles 21 and 2 Samuel 24, is here distinguished from Yahweh, and that's familiar, again, for those who have read Unseen Realms. And the angel here is distinguished from Yahweh by the line, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the mashkit to enter your houses to strike you. Yet elsewhere, we read that it was Yahweh who destroyed the firstborn. This is Psalm 105, 26, and 36. He sent Moses, his servant, and Aaron, whom he had chosen. He, the Lord, in Psalm 105, Yahweh, struck down all the firstborn in their land and the first fruits of all their strength. Psalm 135, 5 and 8. For I know that the Lord is great and that our Lord is above all gods. It was he who struck down the firstborn of Egypt, both of man and beast. Lastly, Psalm 136, 3 and 10. Give thanks to the Lord of lords, for his steadfast love endures forever. To him who struck down the firstborn of Egypt, for his steadfast love endures forever. And remember, the destroying angel of Yahweh is actually the visible Yahweh. Given that background, these statements are not incompatible. However, Psalm 78, 48 to 51 seems to complicate matters. So let me read you that. He, Yahweh in context, gave over their cattle to the hail, and their flocks to the thunderbolts. So this is describing the plagues. He let loose on them his burning anger, wrath, indignation, and distress. A company of destroying angels. Hebrew is malakei ra'im. He made a path for his anger. He did not spare them from death. He gave their lives over to the plague. He struck down every firstborn in Egypt. There it is again. He did this. Yahweh did this. And the first fruits of their strength in the tents of Ham. Now, the complication is only on the surface level. It derives from English. We do not have the mashkit or the shachat terminology here for destroying angels. It's different. It's malakei ra'im, which is literally not, well, you could translate it bad angels, or and that doesn't mean like fallen angels. Ra'ah, or ra, as an adjective in Hebrew, means unfavorable, distasteful, unfortunate, something you don't like. Okay? Something that is against you. It doesn't necessarily mean moral evil or fallenness or anything like that. So the complication is only surface level. Back to my book. The ESV's translation, destroying angels, is somewhat misleading with respect to the terminology we are attempting to trace. The Hebrew term translated destroying is not the word mashkit, associated with the destroyer in the passages we saw earlier. We should also observe that Psalm 78:49 does not say destroying angels killed the firstborn. It doesn't actually say that anyway. That act is once again attributed to Yahweh himself, verse 51. Yahweh may have sent angels to enact the other plagues. Okay, that's perfectly possible from Psalm 78. But the death of the firstborn is attributed to him. These angels do not act in the role of the destroyer. Therefore, given the use of the term mashkit of that angel in other judgments handed down by Yahweh, a coherent way to reconcile all these passages would be to have Yahweh receiving the credit for the judgment on the firstborn by sending out his mashkit, his destroyer, the angel of Yahweh, who elsewhere is identified as being him, as being the visible Yahweh. This would be akin to God himself being present in the burning bush, yet also having the angel of Yahweh present there. These and other passages are the foundations of the later Jewish theology of two powers, the two Yahweh figures. And again, I don't get into the two Yahweh thing in the book Angels. I get into it a lot in Unseen Realm, obviously. But here you go again. Here you go again. And isn't it ironic? Think about it. Since the New Testament writers are going to align Jesus with the second visible Yahweh figure, one of which is this particular angel. You have the destroyer, the destroying angel, who in the Old Testament, was again Yahweh in visible form, judging evil and evildoers, okay, carrying out these sorts of judgments. And yet that same, when we get to the New Testament, we're dealing with incarnation, so it's a bit different. It ups the ante, as I like to say. But you have the second person of the Godhead in human form now by virtue of the birth process, the incarnation, okay? It's the same figure, just a different way of the figure being present. But now you have him laying down his life to protect those who would trust in him. Now he is the substitution for what needs to happen here. He is the substitutionary element. So the irony is pretty rich here. And the theology is just really, you could think a long time about that. Again, just how this stuff sort of turns back on itself and how the tapestry gets woven in the Old Testament and then reaches its culmination point in the New. Here we go again. It's just another example of you could not be exposed to the podcast, to this episode or any other episode of my books or anything like this. You'd still know the gospel story. You could read 1 Corinthians 5:7 about Jesus being our Passover lamb, and okay, I kind of get that. He's the sort of the different counterpart to the sacrifice. You can understand all that, but there's a whole backdrop to it that sort of amplifies what's going on in the mind of the writers and the theological epic, the theological story they're actually telling. You just miss a lot of detail when you're not reading the text in light of its own context. And the destroyer here, it's the denouement, the climax here of Yahweh's war against the gods of Egypt. And who finishes the job? It's the angel of Yahweh, again, who is this second person of the Godhead, come as man, in the form of a man. Again, there's just so many layers to this. So I actually think this is a good episode if you've not gotten into this content, if you're a new listener. But lucky for us, we get to go back into the quagmire of chronology now. And as if that wasn't bad enough, once we actually get to the crossing of the Red Sea, then we have questions like, well, the Hebrews actually says Yam Suf, the Reed Sea. Is that the Red Sea, or is it something different? Does it matter? Is this a literal concept, or is it something to do with, chaos, thinking in both on Egypt's side and the Israelite side? What's the route of the Exodus? And that actually depends on where the Israelites turn at different points and in what direction. And of course, nobody knows, and so, you get into all these issues. So what I decided to do was today, we're going to call this part 1, Exodus 12, because we're not going to get out of Exodus 12 proper. I mean, there's lots of other passages we're going to look at, but that's where we're going to camp. And we're going to cover 2 issues. One is the issue of large numbers in the Old Testament. And the other is going to be the duration of the sojourn, the period of bondage in Egypt. So the second one there is a chronological issue. But we're going to spend enough time on those that we can't actually get into the date of the Exodus. So that's the next time. So that part 2 is going to be just how do the early date defenders defend that position? How do the late date defenders defend that position? So we'll spend a whole episode on the dating problem. And then we'll finally hit the crossing of the Red Sea. We'll loop in the pillar of the cloud thing. And again, the information is scattered in several of these chapters. And we'll probably hit Exodus 15 in there too, because that's the Song of Moses, which is about the crossing. I still don't know what to do with the beginning of chapter 13, because that's this offering of the firstborn, which is just sort of thrown in there, or at least that's the way it looks. So eventually, in a few weeks, we'll get to the Red Sea. And then once we're there, we'll have to tackle the whole problem of the itinerary. And of course, that is going to factor into where's Sinai. So we're back to Sinai again. So Sinai and chronology and dating, again, these things are controversies because there's no clear, self-evident answer to any of these questions. But again, our job here is just to make listeners aware of that and sort of get down into the nuts and bolts and, see what the items are that scholars discuss. And then we'll just go from there.
Sounds good to me.
So that was a long answer to your short question.
No, that's okay.
I'm a little vexed by, okay, what do I do when and where and why and how and all that kind of stuff. But we're just, this episode is pretty clear cut because we're going to be in essentially a couple of verses in chapter 12. So with that much said, here we go back into chapter 12. I'm going to read verses 33 through 41, which in the ESV and lots of other Bibles, they give the header, the Exodus. Well, it's sort of the Exodus, but it's actually the beginning of the Exodus. And the Exodus is going to get picked up later, which again, as I just explained, is part of the problem. But these verses say, this is verses 33 through 41, Exodus 12. The Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, which is a great line. I guess so. For they said, we shall all be dead. Get rid of them or we're all going to die. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in their cloaks on their shoulders. The people of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. And the people of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. The time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It was a night of watching by the Lord to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So this same night is a night of watching, kept to the Lord by all the people of Israel throughout their generations. So we'll stop there, because then the rest of chapter 12 goes into the Passover, which we've already talked about. Again, it's just this back and forth content in these chapters. So what I want to focus on here are 2 issues. I've already mentioned them, the large numbers problem and the issue of how long was the sojourn in Egypt, which is related to the overall chronological discussion. So let's take them in order. First issue really derives from verse 37. I'll read it again, Exodus 12:37. The people of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. And then, of course, besides the flocks too, and the herds. So this huge number and these kinds of numbers are going to show up elsewhere, like when they take a census. And there's actually 2 censuses before a different book. You have book of Numbers. You have both of these, and when they are about to go in the land, they fail, and then they renumber the people after the 40 years of wandering, and so on and so forth. So you get these large numbers that pop up in the Exodus and the wilderness wandering narratives, and this is a famous and I would say a very real problem. Now, Carpenter in his commentary just mentions this. He says, the number of persons involved is huge, so huge, in fact, that it has tried the genius of exegetes for centuries as to how to interpret the figure of 600,000 men on foot, apart from women, children, women, and other men of various age groups. So there's even other men, the ones that are too old to be among what you would think of as those who can walk this kind of distance. And again, that's not to mention the animals too. Carpenter continues and he says, various attempts have been made to deal with the figures. The number 600,000 may be of theological importance if it is not textually corrupt. The issue must be seen as an interpretive one, not one of belief or unbelief in God's ability to rescue a certain number of people. God's actions and words created the universe, a project of unfathomable proportions. That act indicates that he has the power over all creation. The theological perspective and literary purpose of the text are the key to understanding the writer, as well as any attempt to understand how large numbers functioned in the literature of the New Kingdom of Egypt, or even in the ancient Near Eastern world in general. We are dealing with certain historical facts. The facts are necessary, but the religious and theological significance they bear is most important. Are the numbers to be taken literally? Are they to be read symbolically, but in some sense of the term in which the reality of the worldly author is the controlling referent? Or are they the perfect fulfillment in theological terms of God's promise to Abraham concerning his descendants? What reality is being referred to, since biblical reality encompasses history and the divine sphere, and the covenantal world of Israel as well? The meta-narrative of Israel's God intersects with the cultural world of Israel at this time to convey both historical and meta-historical truth. Now, that's kind of academese in the way that that's put. What I'm going to do at this point, I think, I'm going to read something I wrote for the Faith Life Study Bible about the large numbers problem, and then I'm going to go to an article by a guy I know. In fact, this guy was my first Hebrew teacher at Dallas. He actually did his dissertation on the large numbers problem. So I'm going to be referencing both these things, but let's just jump in here. I think this is a bit more readable and I think a bit more illustrative of the fact that this is a very real problem. This is not a contrived problem or some sort of dumb argument from skeptics. This is a real problem. So in the Faith Life Study Bible, I wrote this. This is one of those excursus parts of the study Bible. In the census following the Exodus from Egypt, Numbers 146, the number of Israelite males older than 20 years of age is 603,550. At the second census, Numbers 2651, there are 601,730. Those are just the men 20 years of age, and older. These figures imply that the total population of the fledgling nation of Israel was somewhere between 2 and 3 million. While these figures are difficult to reconcile with the geography of Canaan and the archaeological record, several solutions are possible. At least this is what people have tried to do. Now let me just stop there. The issue with the geography of Canaan and the archaeological record are things like this. I'll just telegraph this point. There are certain roads that the Israelites could have taken, like to cross the desert, in different places. And initially they're like between towns. They go from this point, and they turn to that point, and they turn again, and so on and so forth. Geographically, in many of these places, there just isn't room. Literally, there isn't room, spatial area, for this many people to turn more than like 3 or 4 people abreast. If you've got 2 to 3 million people, it would take weeks or months just to get past a single signpost point. It's like the Three Stooges. The three of them try to get through the same doorway at the same time, and they clog the doorway. That's what you're dealing with in certain points of the geography, along this route that we're given in the Torah, in Exodus, Numbers, or other places. They literally would have to, no more than 3 or 4 across here to plus then you got the animals too. It would take weeks or months just for the whole lot of them to cross a single place, a single line. Where the first person crossed, and a month later, then the last of them to get to that point. There literally isn't enough time in the Exodus itinerary for that kind of thing to happen by the Bible's own record of things. So it's a real problem. Archaeologically, once they get into the land, if you're dealing with this many people, well, then logically, you would need a certain number of cities or towns or villages where they live. It would be tens of thousands of them. But you don't have that. You don't have anywhere, you might have a few hundred. You don't have anywhere close in terms of settled towns from the archaeological record that can accommodate these numbers. So this is a real problem. It's not a contrived problem. Now, to illustrate this, I also wrote this, the problem illustrated. Several passages present challenges to the large figures of the book of Numbers. And of course, here we have it in Exodus 12 as well. Deuteronomy 7, 1-7 presents Israel, now get this, as the least numerous nation in Canaan at the time of the conquest. It actually says and lists 7 other nations that were larger. This means that if the figures in Numbers are to be taken literally, that the total population of these 8 nations collectively would have to range from 16 to 24 million people, roughly the 2010 population of Florida or Texas, respectively. The size of Canaan, however, is closer to that of New Jersey than either of those states. So take the whole population of Texas and stick it in New Jersey and assume that every square foot of it is livable, and you can see the problem. There's just not enough room. And you need water. So you can't just have every square foot occupied. You got cattle. Where are they going to, are you riding them the whole time? It's a comedy. It's ridiculous to imagine this at these numbers. There literally isn't the square footage, the square mileage in this place that we call Canaan to have 8 nations, the smallest of which is like roughly 3 million. So there's just something going on here. Further considerations help put the problem into perspective. If you go back, this is again from the Faith Life Study Bible. The Israelites left Egypt with, quote, about 600,000 men on foot besides dependents, Exodus 12:37. God did not provide the Israelites with manna until roughly 45 days later, Exodus 16, verse 1, meaning that 2 to 3 million people required a different food source for 45 days. If a family of 5 sacrificed one lamb or some other animal each day to feed themselves, because they don't have farms, folks. This is a migrant community, all right? If a family of 5 sacrificed one lamb or some other animal each day to feed themselves, the Israelites would have to slaughter 120,000 lambs every day, meaning the Israelites would have to have left Egypt with 5.4 million animals. Even if they ate meat only a third of the time, like, for 15 of the 45 days, they still would have had to slaughter 40,000 animals per day and leave Egypt with 1.8 million animals. I mean, can you imagine the poop? I mean, it's just logistically, it's untenable. And let's be honest, it just doesn't work. The manna also compounds the issue. According to Exodus 16:13-21, there was enough manna on the ground to feed each Israelite every day. Now that's a really amazing trick, because basically the ground is covered with people. It's like standing room only. The Israelites gathered an average of 1 omer, roughly 2 quarts of manna each day. Exodus 16, and 17. This implies that 1 to 1.5 million gallons of manna appeared on the ground every day. Finally, the Old Testament itself hints that the 2 to 3 million number is unlikely. In Numbers 33:49, it is noted that the Israelites, quote, camped by the Jordan from Beth Jeshimoth up to Abel Shittim on the desert plain of Moab, unquote. Since Beth Jeshimoth and Abel Shittim were approximately 7 miles from each other, the area of the Israelite encampment would have been about 49 square miles. Now, did you hear that? 49 square miles. You got to fit 2 to 3 million people plus the animals in 49 square miles. By comparison, New York City, which had a population of 8.1 million in 2010, covers 305 square miles. Taking the number 2 to 3 million at face value, therefore, requires that the Israelite camp had a slightly greater population density than New York City without any multi-level living accommodations. They're not building skyscrapers, folks. They're not even building 2-floor houses. They're in tents. They're all on the ground. Again, this is a real problem. The numbers are just crazy. Now, my friend Dave Fouts, and we have a link to this article posted on the episode website, because this article is available free online. The article is entitled "A Defense of the Hyperbolic Interpretation of Large Numbers in the Old Testament." It's from the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society, volume 40, number 3, in 1997. It's about a 10-page article. So I'm going to draw from this article, but the article itself is drawn from Dave's dissertation. This is what he did his dissertation on at Dallas Seminary. And in the dissertation and in the article, he provides some other telling, and I think a bit humorous, examples where taking the large numbers literally in the Old Testament just doesn't work by the Bible's own record. Now, here are some of what he illustrates this with. For example, the number of Levites and of Israelite firstborn. I mean, this is the kind of stuff you'd never think of unless you were noodling this problem. Okay, Numbers 3 records several large numbers that cause problems if taken at face value. Concerning the number of Levites, 3 group totals are given, the sum of which is 22,000. It's Numbers 3:39. The sum as given is incorrect. It should be 22,300. The number of all Israelite firstborn is given as 22,273. That's Numbers 3:43, with 273 being the excess above the number of the Levites. Okay, G.B. Gray, who's an Old Testament commentator, has pointed out that this would yield at least 25 sons per family, given a population of between 2 and 3 million persons. So if you're going to take the 2 and 3 million at face value, that means every family had 25 boys, again, not to mention the girls. So he says the figures do indeed appear to be difficult if taken at face value. Here's another example. The number of Ephraimites in Judges 12. Judges 12:6 states that for mispronouncing Shibboleth, 42,000 Ephraimites were slain at the River Jordan, a number that exceeds the census total for the entire tribe in either Numbers 1, there it's at 40,500, or Numbers 26, there it's 32,500. Even allowing for an increase of the Ephraimite warrior population after the conquest does not alleviate the problem of the enormity of the number of those slain. So you really can't kill more than actually exist, is the problem. The number is obviously artificial for some reason. Another example, the wall at Aphek. 1 Kings 20, verse 30 asserts that after Israel had killed 100,000 Syrian foot soldiers at a nearby battle, 27,000 more fled into the city of Aphek, where a wall fell on them, apparently killing them as well. I mean, if you just read it, that's the suggestion. One would think that this wall, or its remains, would be somewhat comparable to the Great Wall of China, to be so calamitous in its collapse that it would have been at least partially unearthed by now. In other words, this wall, to kill 27,000 people, this wall has to be really long. And the question then arises, well, Aphek's been excavated. Where's like this wall that's like a mile or a couple miles or a few miles long? I mean, Fouts compares it to the Great Wall of China to make the point. It's got to be a really long wall to kill this many people. Again, it just sounds kind of absurd. Again, if you take the numbers at face value. If there is some other significance to the large numbers, Fouts says, however, the size of the wall may not matter. And again, this is where he's going to go, into his solution. But before we get there, I want to go back to what I wrote in the Faith Life Study Bible and say, just give you a bit of an overview here before I head back into Fouts. So again, in the study Bible I wrote, since taking the numbers of the census figures at face value yields these issues, of course, and others, I'm just being selective here. Several solutions have been proposed. And so on proposed solutions, this is the way I sketched it out. According to the most frequently cited proposal, the Hebrew word for thousand, eleph, may also mean tribe or clan. For example, Numbers 10:4, Judges 6:5, 1 Samuel 10:19. If so, the numbers may simply refer to military units, which corresponds to the aim of the censuses to determine the number of males eligible for Israel's army. The chapters and numbers that record the censuses then use eleph as both a number and a term for a unit. However, the only examples where eleph might plausibly refer to something other than a number have nothing to do with counting. I mean, if you actually look them up, this is the problem you run into. Moreover, in other passages that do involve counting, for example, Exodus 18:21, 1 Samuel 8:12, 2 Samuel 18:1, the term does not have any other meaning than mathematical tabulation, in other words, 1,000. Another proposal claims that the author of Numbers deliberately exaggerated the numbers, and of course this would be the author of Exodus as well, doing the same thing. But they deliberately exaggerated the numbers associated with the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings. In other words, they represent literary hyperbole. Comparisons with other ancient Semitic texts of similar genres, like military annals, validate this suggestion. Ancient Sumerian, Akkadian, and Assyrian literature, particularly royal, inscriptional, and historical annals, deliberately employed hyperbole regarding large numbers. The annals aimed to glorify the God of the king by exaggerating the king's victories. In fact, the biblical accounts of the Exodus and conquest bear striking similarities to contemporary annals in many ways. Given this, the hyperbolic use of numbers in the Old Testament anchors the biblical text to the writing conventions of the time. Let me read that over. Given this, if we assume that the numbers here are deliberately exaggerated, they're hyperbole, okay? The hyperbolic use of numbers in the Old Testament anchors the biblical text to the writing conventions of the time. This is an argument that favors their authenticity as truly ancient documents. The writer of these accounts thus could have used a known literary device to draw attention to the might of Yahweh, the King of Kings, earthly or divine, in delivering his people Israel. Now, this is where Fouts goes. This is Fouts' view, and his article defends the hyperbolic use of numbers in the Old Testament. And what he writes, I'll just cite a few things from him. He says in section 5, use of large numbers in other ancient Near Eastern contexts, he writes this. Quite often, large numbers were employed in a hyperbolic fashion in the historiographic literatures of Sumer, Akkad, and Assyria, particularly in the royal, inscriptional, and annalistic genres. The hyperbolic numbers occur in military contexts, expressing the number of troops engaged in battle, the number of enemies slain or captured, the amount of spoil taken, the amount of corvée labor employed. It is evident from my study, says Fouts, that no other culture used numbers in excess of 100,000 with the same frequency as does the Old Testament. Where numbers in excess of 100,000 do occur, they are found exclusively in military contexts or something to do with, again, like in Exodus. But basically what he's saying is the numbers are large there, and because the numbers are going to be large in the census because it has to do with not ultimately fleeing Egypt, but the number of people that are going to be, or the fact that the promised land needs to be conquered. That's why we get these large numbers in there. So he's saying even the flight from Egypt, those people are ultimately going to be the people, or are intended to be the people who are going to conquer the land. So you still have this conquest, this militaristic sort of flavor going on in the bigger picture. What Fouts does is he goes to Akkadian examples, Sargon the First, Ramush of Akkad, Shalmaneser the First, Tukulti and Nerta the First, and so on and so forth. He has a number of these. And he writes this, the language of this epic literature is of course hyperbolic. One notes the terms, quote, without number, unquote, end quote, beyond counting, unquote, in synonymous parallelism to the specific numbers. And the example he uses here has the number at 3 million. So he says, this may support the hypothesis of my dissertation that at times the large numbers in other genres are also to be understood as literary hyperbole. Two of his main points are Scripture is similar to other ancient historiography in that it may use large numbers hyperbolically in these contexts, and Scripture is similar to other ancient historiography in that the ostensible purpose of this usage is to demonstrate the relative magnitude of a given leader or king. Yahweh is greater than David, who is greater than Solomon, who is greater than Rehoboam, who is greater than others, and so on and so forth. This is why the numbers change and they get smaller and so on and so forth. Now, his conclusion is this. I'll just read it to you. One must wonder what implications the results of this study could have on Old Testament scholarship, particularly in the area of conquest models. As has been noted earlier, the large numbers have often been a stumbling block for accepting the biblical accounts as legitimate records of history. If the numbers are simply reflective of a rhetorical device common in ancient Near Eastern literature, however, one may no longer question the integrity of the record by use of this argument. In other words, he's saying, if the hyperbolic view is correct, then critics cannot use the large numbers to say that the accounts are unhistorical, because the writers would be using exactly the same conventions as the writers of military annals from Sumer and Akkad and so on, and all, Babylon, all these other places, Assyria, that everybody accepts as historical. If the biblical writers are doing the same thing, then the numbers shouldn't matter. They're not disqualifiers for authenticity or historicity. That's Fouts' big point here. He says the large numbers are often simply figures of speech employed to magnify King Yahweh, King David, or others in a theologically based historiographical narrative. For us, again, this is me speaking now, we're done with Fouts, but for us, we look at that, and when what Fouts has just said, I think is a really good point. I think he's really onto something here, that it is illegitimate to use the problem of the numbers to say that these accounts in the Torah cannot be historical. That is bogus, again, Fouts' point, because this other material that no one questions reflect actually real events. They do exactly the same thing. And everybody knows that this is a literary convention for this other ancient Near Eastern material. So why then exclude the Bible from that same rhetorical or literary technique? If you're going to be consistent and say that it's a product of its own time, then this is no longer an argument against biblical historicity. It's actually an argument in favor of it. But for us, I would tell people, if you're just breaking into the series, go back to the first episode we did on Exodus when we talked about history and historicity, how we think about history. For us, we're not expecting that, since this isn't the way we do military chronicling. For us, it feels like exaggeration takes away from historicity. But what Fouts is actually arguing is that no, it actually confirms it, because it puts the Old Testament into the same category as this other stuff that people don't question. And if you're going to just pick on the Old Testament, well, then you're inconsistent. Then you have some sort of religious axe to grind or some worldview axe to grind or whatever. But again, to me, that makes very good sense, what he's arguing here for. But I'm just, for the sake of our audience here, for us, we just don't think of history this way. We're not expecting that. Because if we were to write a history of any big war today or any big event, we're like combing the records, to get the exact body count and all, because that's just the way we do things. They didn't. Nobody in the ancient Near East did. So for the original biblical world, literate readers in that world were expecting this. They knew exactly what was going on with these inflated numbers. It was a familiar way of history writing for them. They would not have felt deceived, since the point wasn't mathematical accuracy, but ultimately glorification of the king or the military leader or the deity behind those guys. A precise count wasn't even in the picture for either the writers or their original readers. Everybody knows what's going on. Everybody sort of knows the rules of the game. They know the rhetorical rules of the genre. Literate readers know what their writers are doing. It conforms perfectly to their expectations, but it doesn't conform to ours at all. So we have a decision to make. Are we going to let the Bible be what it is, or are we going to wish it were something that it wasn't or isn't and was never intended to be? Do we bend it to our will, our expectation? And again, I think this is another area where I've said it before, and I'll say it again. When you do that, when you make the Bible conform to your expectations, the way you would do things, you make it vulnerable. You make it an easy target. If you let it be what it is and try to understand it the way that the writers were thinking and the way that the readers were thinking, what they received from the writers, there's a coherence to it. There are reasons why these things are the way they are. They're thinking one set of ideas. They're not thinking of the other set of ideas that we might be thinking. We're different. We're different from them. They're not us. So what this means, for us, is that while we read Old Testament accounts, we can't presume to have a real body count, as it were. Like if we went back with a calculator and spreadsheet, and put boots on the ground and counted everybody, like it would all come out literally the same if we did that, if we did time travel and everybody was armed with Excel spreadsheets or something. So we can't know that, but we can know that Israel had great victories and God had fulfilled his promise to multiply Abraham's descendants like the stars of the heavens, which again is another hyperbole. Just taking the numerical approach, and I realize we had David Burnett on here before, and with the stars of heaven, again, that's not only a numerical thing, a numerical metaphor, it's also a qualitative metaphor. But I don't want to drift off into earlier episodes of the podcast. But if you're just thinking, numerically, that's a hyperbole, like the stars in the heaven. And everybody knows that. Everybody knows it's not supposed to be an exact, precise number. Everybody knows that. Well, in the ancient world, these inflated numbers were they were sort of like these sorts of expressions. They were intentional. They had a goal to accomplish, and that was the glorification of the king or the military leader or their god or gods. And everybody knew that. So nobody was surprised. Everybody knew what they had on their hands. The second issue, let's transition to the second issue, derives from verse 40. And again, here we get to go muck around in the chronological stuff again. So let me read verses 40 through 41. So after we get this description of the mixed multitude and the big numbers and all that stuff and the animals, we read this, Exodus 12, 40, 41. The time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. Okay? Now the verse deals, specifically verse 40, deals with the length of the sojourn in Egypt, the length of Israel being in Egypt. It appears to be in conflict with other verses and therefore creates problems for Israelite chronology. Here are the other verses. In Galatians, in the New Testament, Galatians 3:17, Paul says, "This is what I mean. The law, which came 430 years afterward, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God so as to make the promise void." So you say, well, 430 years afterwards, after what? Well, if we actually go to Galatians 3, what precedes verse 17, we read this. The promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say into offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. This is what I mean, the law that came 430 years afterwards. So that sets the time at the 430 years there are really sort of looping Abraham in when Abraham received the promises. But that isn't what Exodus 12 says. Exodus 12 says the time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. So where's Paul getting this 430 years? Why is he including Abraham? It doesn't align. Another example, it appears in conflict with Genesis 15, 13 through 16. So let's just go there. I'll go back to verse 13. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. It's not 430, 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here, your offspring, shall come back here in the fourth generation. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Okay, so it seems to equate the 400 with 4 generations, so a generation of 100 years. But you have 4 of them, you got 400 years. But that's not 430. Then you have Acts 7:6. This is part of Stephen's speech. God spoke to this effect that his offspring would be sojourners in a land belonging to others who would enslave them and afflict them for 400 years. So that seems to be drawing on Genesis 15, verse 13 through 16. There's another one, Acts 13:20, but we'll get to that in a moment. That's a bit different. So what we have here, though, is we have Exodus 12:40 and 41 in the Masoretic text, traditional text, saying that the people of Israel lived in Egypt 430 years. So what do we do with the extra 30 years that seems to be in conflict with Genesis 15, which of course lies behind Acts 7? When we really think about it, we also have a problem with Galatians 3:16 and 17 because he loops Abraham in as well. Paul does. So we have numbers, 400 and 430, that have slightly different contexts. And of course, the numbers themselves are different. So what's going on here? Like, what do we do that? What do we do with that? Well, there are a couple of ways to approach this. You might think, first of all, just one approach. Wouldn't it be nice if instead of Exodus 12:40 saying the time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years, instead of it saying that, it said something like, now the sojourn of the children of Israel during which they dwelt in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan was 430 years. Wouldn't that be nice? Because that, in other words, that would loop Abraham and his time in Canaan into the 430 years, and that would seem to agree with Paul. Wouldn't it be nice if the text just said that? Well, guess what? It does in the Septuagint. What I just read to you was Rolf's edition of the Septuagint. That's what it says. Now, other manuscripts of the Septuagint actually have 435, but at least we have a Septuagint tradition that has 430 and loops Abraham into the picture. So you could say that Paul was evidently using a Septuagint that was basically, again, what I just read about. They dwelled in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan. That phrase is added, 430 years. So Paul in Galatians 3:16 and 17 and Exodus 12:40 would actually agree in this scenario. Paul is essentially paraphrasing the content of the Septuagint, which loops the patriarchs into the number of Exodus 12:40. Well, that would be nice, but we still have to deal with what about the 400 number in other passages? Genesis 15:13 through 16 and Acts 7, verse 6. Can we reconcile this 430 and Abraham's in the loop here, so that takes care of the 430, at least it seems to. And then what about the 400? Well, go back to the Genesis passage and listen to it closely. Here's how you would reconcile these things. Verse 13. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs and will be their servants and be afflicted for 400 years. They see what I did there. I could say, well, in Genesis 15:13, God is talking to Abraham, and he doesn't loop Abraham into the number, into the number of the sojourning. He tells Abraham, look, your offspring, your descendants will be sojourners in a land for 400 years. So it's not you. So that kind of opens the door for a time in Egypt less than 430 that we could say, well, maybe 400. We could postulate that the 400 years in Genesis 15:13 through 15 refers to the actual bondage, the bad time in Egypt. Well, 430 would be, maybe at a time that, we could say Jacob and his descendants lived in Egypt and it wasn't bad at all. After all, there was an interval between the time Jacob and his family get there and the time in Exodus 1 where things start to really go bad. Well, there are problems here too, because not only, again, if we're depending on the Septuagint, and we're looking back at Paul is still obviously kind of thinking of Abraham in some way here. And we can't get Abraham within 30 years of the lifetime of Jacob, so we still have that problem. And Exodus 1 seems to suggest that the enslavement situation came toward the tail end of Israel's time in Egypt. Or it could be read that way. It doesn't have to be read that way. Maybe, again, a better way to take it is that, the period of affliction, maybe it did last 400 years. Because as we read Exodus 1, Exodus 1, says, hey, there arose a Pharaoh that didn't know Joseph. Again, that's shortly after Jacob dies. And things just go sour progressively. It starts out one way and then it ends with, slavery and killing the Israelite boys and all, it just gets worse. So maybe it does stretch out 400 years. Maybe we're okay. But again, we're getting closer to a reconciliation, but we're still not quite there. Because we have the Abraham thinking in Paul's head. Maybe Paul is, this is possible, because the New Testament writers do this. Maybe Paul is thinking of both passages, both Genesis 15 and Exodus 12, and just summarizing, paraphrasing, and putting them both together. That's why he thinks of Abraham, the time, when the covenant was launched, and the 400 years of bondage there. And he's also thinking of Exodus 12, the 430, making that, maybe that's Jacob's early good time. He was still in Egypt, but it wasn't in bondage, and they were only afflicted 400. I mean, you could see how these things could, get mixed, not in a wrong way, but you could see how Paul could be thinking of all these passages and sort of just shorthanding it in Galatians 3 to just present a summary in the space of a verse, 2 verses, what happened here. I mean, you can get there. You can sort of deal with the 400 and the 430, that way. Now, Sarna, in his Exodus commentary, notes that the rabbinic material puts kind of an interesting twist on this. He says, the first part is already familiar to us, but I'm going to read it anyway. The historical summation of verses 40 and 41, this is Exodus 12, do not exactly accord with the 400 years of Egyptian oppression predicted in Genesis 15:13. The Mechiltah, and by the way, that's a compilation of essentially Jewish legal theory, halakhic midrash on the book of Exodus. The Mechiltah resolves the discrepancy by attributing the 30-year difference to the interval between God's covenant with Abraham and the birth of Isaac. So it brings Isaac into the picture. Although the text, Sarna admits, speaks clearly enough only of the Egyptian episode. It doesn't really say anything about Isaac. The inclusion of the sojourn in Canaan in the computation is explicit in the text of the Septuagint, which we already read, and also the Samaritan Pentateuch. Now that isn't really helpful because that sort of just tells us what we already know. Here's the interesting part. Here's the interesting twist that Sarna sort of triangulates for. He notes that maybe the numbers, again, aren't to be taken at face value, but they are what they are because of a preference, a literary preference for mathematical symmetry. Now catch this. This is Sarna again. He writes, Ibn Ezra, again, a famous rabbinic teacher, begins the 430-year reckoning with the departure of Abraham from Haran for Canaan. And in fact, exactly 215 years elapsed between that event and Jacob's migration to Egypt, yielding the same time span for the stay of the Israelites in Egypt. So you have 215 years on one side and 215 years on the other. And of course, you put them together, and that equals 430. Sarna writes, this kind of symmetry follows a symmetrical pattern well established in the patriarchal narratives and elsewhere in the book of Genesis. Thus, Abraham lived 75 years in the home of his father and 75 years in the lifetime of his son Isaac. He was 100 years of age at the birth of Isaac, and he lived 100 years in Canaan. Jacob lived 17 years with Joseph in Canaan, and a like period with him in Egypt. 10 generations separated Noah from Adam, and another 10 generations from Abraham to Noah. In the light of these facts, it may be that the neatly balanced periods of time are intended to be rhetorical rather than literal. That is, they underline the biblical ideal of history as the fulfillment of God's deliberate design. In the worldview of the Bible, history cannot be merely a series of disconnected and haphazard events. Unquote. That's the end of Sarna. So basically, Sarna is saying maybe we ought to think about the numbers being what they are, because the writer wants to tie two sections of God's work on earth through the patriarchs or through his people Israel or through Adam to Noah or whatever. That the numbers are what they are to specifically connect two equal halves in terms of the numerical number given to each half. Maybe that's intentional. Maybe they're supposed to be brought together. Maybe the number given to them, people are supposed to discern that if you cut the number in half, then you look for both halves somewhere else in the chronological comments, like the age years given for people or between events, just so that you're supposed to connect the two sets. And it's not about a literal chronology or historical chronology in terms of time on earth. Maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is, again, to bring two things together because they're equal halves. So that's fascinating. And again, my judgment would be that's really worth thinking about. I don't know that that's the case here with the number 430, but it's actually pretty interesting. So if you like that idea, the solution therefore to Exodus 12:40 would be simple for you, or you might think. The solution might be easy enough. Well, we've got 430 years. It's an artificial number in terms of like literal chronology, but it connects these two things. That number is chosen for symmetry. Again, that seems to work because we have other symmetrical patterns that emerge when we're looking for this kind of thing in Scripture. But again, if you're going to go that route, if you take that approach, it does call into general questions the literalness of the numbers. In other words, could other numbers associated with the Exodus and Israelite history be artificial for the same symmetrical, literary, rhetorical, theological purposes? I mean, we have this in the New Testament very obviously in the genealogy of Jesus. In Matthew, you have the three sets of 14. Again, there's a deliberate reason why it's structured that way. It skips generations if you compare that genealogy back to the Old Testament material. There's a symmetry created there in the three sets, and there's also a gematria thing that emerges from the way the numbers are arranged and all that sort of stuff. It points to David, but again, I don't want to get into that in this episode. But there are things like this that happen. So you look at that and you say, well, okay, maybe 430 is 215 plus 215, and we don't really know if we should attach real time to that or not. But if you decide, well, I want to have my cake and eat it too. I kind of like that explanation, but I still want the 430 and the 215s, to mean something. And I'm going to keep them for historical markers, chronology and real time. If you do that, then you must embrace the late date of the Exodus. And Gleason Archer, who was not a late dater, saw this very clearly. He writes in his book, Survey of Old Testament Introduction, he says, as to the length of the sojourn of the Israelites in Egypt, the clear statement of the Hebrew text of Exodus 12:40 is that it totaled 430 years from the migration of Jacob's family until the Exodus itself. But since the Septuagint here reads that the 430 years included the sojourn of Abraham and his descendants into Canaan as well as Egypt, some have preferred this variant to the reading of the Masoretic text. Some like the Septuagint better. This would result in a specifically Egyptian sojourn of about 215 years. Okay, so if you're going to take the second half of the 215 as literal chronological history, then you have a sojourn of 215 years. And if you plug that into real time, guess what? Archer writes, that would bring Joseph's career squarely into the Hyksos period. And that is precisely what the late date advocates. Joseph was part of the Hyksos period. Late date, the date of the Exodus is in the 13th century BC, the 1200s somewhere. So Archer realizes this. And again, he's going to argue against the Septuagint reading. He's going to argue against, adopting the 430 and all this kind of stuff because, Archer is committed to the early date in his introduction. Now, Hoffmeyer, who is a late dater, says this. Paul allots 430 years between Abrahamic and the Sinaitic covenants, or the time between Abraham and the Exodus, indicating that he followed the Septuagint chronology. He has a footnote here. According to the Masoretic text chronology, 645 years separate the two, between the Abrahamic and the Sinai covenants. 645 years, according to the Masoretic text. Exodus 12:40 has a different reading in the Septuagint than does the Masoretic text. The Septuagint envisions two periods of 215 years totaling 430. 215 years spent by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in Canaan prior to the family's move to Egypt, and 215 years in Egypt prior to the Exodus. So it's quite a variance between the two textual traditions. And what Hoffmeyer does with this is he says, look, Paul used the Septuagint, so I'm good with that. And of course, Hoffmeyer's a late dater anyway. But again, to be fair to him, it seems like he really genuinely does consider this fairly compelling, that Paul has this specific chronology in his head, And if you're going to adopt that chronology as real-time chronological history, then Joseph is a Hyksos. And then you can only have the Exodus in the 13th century. Now, again, next week in the next episode, we're going to talk about how the early date and the late date defend each other and respond to each other. But I'm just telling you right now, the problem already sort of emerges right here. And it really did back in Exodus 1 when we talked about Ramesses and the names and Pithom and Ramesses and all that kind of stuff. So we're going to deal with that again and hopefully put some closure to it, at least in terms of the coverage next week. So if you adopt a late date Exodus, you're done now. You're good with the Septuagint. You know how you're going to handle Exodus 12:40, how you're going to read that verse in relation to Genesis 15. You're good with what Paul does. You're good. But what if you don't like the late date? Okay. Well, that means you've got to stay with the Masoretic text. And the Masoretic text says we've got 430 years. That's the number given in Exodus 12:40 and Galatians 3:16 and 17. And then we have a 400-year number in Genesis 15, 13 through 16 and Acts 7:6. So your strategy would be this. You would say, okay, the Exodus 12:40 reference, 430 years, quote, this is a direct quote from Exodus 12:40, of the Israelites living in Egypt. So that can only be understood as the time when Jacob gets there, okay, through the bondage, and then the Exodus happens. Okay, so you've got 430 years. You got to go with that. Then Genesis 15, you would say, well, that refers to 400 years of affliction. You could say, well, the 30 years, maybe the extra 30 years in Exodus 12, verse 40, maybe that refers to the time when Jacob's there, he's with Joseph, and it's not, they're not living under affliction. They're not in bondage. It's a normal, kind of relationship. And when things start to go sour from that, the point that they start to go sour all the way to the Exodus, well, that's 400 years. So that's how you would have to read this. So and we've already covered, some of that ground earlier. So this is how you would have to handle things. Now, the only outlier here is what do I do with Abraham? Because again, Galatians 3:16 and 17 seems to suggest that Abraham is lurking in Paul's head when he's referencing 430 years. And again, I've already told you what you'd have to do here, but just to summarize it again, you'd have to say, look, the reason why Paul mentions these things, Abraham in verse 16, the giving of the Abrahamic covenant, and then he goes into the 430 years, is because Paul has both passages, both Genesis 15 and Exodus 12 in his head, and he's just summarizing things in Galatians 3:16 and 17. That's essentially what you have to do. You have to assume that Paul's paraphrase of the text is not designed to loop Abraham into the 430 years. It's incidental to the 430 years. So take your pick. If you like that view and you stick with the Masoretic text, then you can still argue for the early date of the Exodus. If you want to say, I don't think that's what Paul was thinking, I think Paul is looping this stuff together, blah, 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 and I'm going to go with the Septuagint, that means Joseph is in the Hyksos period and we have to have a late date Exodus. Well, good for you. Again, both of these things are possible. I'm giving you both trajectories on how you would have to deal, again, with the data. Now, there's a couple outliers here. Isn't that wonderful? One outlier is Acts 13:20. It's not really a big one. Well, neither of these are lethal to anything, but they might occur to somebody listening in the audience. Acts 13:20 says this, and I'm actually going to read verses 16 through 20. So Paul stood up and motioning with his hand. Again, this is when Paul is in trouble again, like he usually is. Okay, so he wants to speak to the crowd. Men of Israel, and you who fear God, listen. The God of this people Israel chose our fathers and made the people great during their stay in the land of Egypt. And with uplifted arm, he led them out of it. And for about 40 years, he put up with them in the wilderness. And after destroying 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he gave them their land as an inheritance. All this took about 450 years. And after that, he gave them judges until Samuel the prophet. So the 450 years here for Paul means this. It's the time from, well, let me just ask, what it means. The 450 years, look at the phrases Paul uses, that God chose our fathers. Now, does that include Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or is it just a generic reference to the Israelites who have gone before us? Then he has the phrase, their stay in the land of Egypt. Okay, that's a clear reference to the sojourn in Egypt, period of affliction. Then he references 40 years of wandering. Then he references the conquest. And he says, all that's about 450 years. Now, with respect to our earlier verses that have the numbers 400 and 430 in them, if you took the 400, for the affliction, let's just say that the first phrase chose our fathers. And then as Paul says that, he links it to their stay in the land of Egypt. Let's just interpret that as saying, well, Paul's talking about when the Israelites went into Egypt. Our fathers would be Jacob and his sons, his 12 sons, Israel. Okay, and so if you're going to do it that way, and you're going to move Abraham out of the picture, then you would just add the numbers this way. If you're using the 400 as the number for affliction, 400 plus 40 plus 7 is 447. That's about 450 years. If you're using the 430, you'd come up with a total of 477. And you'd have to say, well, that's about 450 years. A little bit more, but it's not a big deal. Both views would say that the number 450 is an approximation. That's how you would do this. Okay, so either side, there are your trajectories. Pick the one you like. Second outlier, and this issue isn't directly related to the duration of the bondage in our topic, but it is a cautionary tale. Here's why I put it in here. It's a cautionary tale about using the concepts of generations and genealogies to do biblical chronology. And I know everybody says, just look at the genealogies and just add the numbers up. There you go. The world created in 4004 BC, all that kind of, okay. That's nonsensical. And this is a textbook illustration of why. Okay. So this is a good cautionary tale. As such, it is worthwhile to get into this. How a literal face value reading of years and genealogies may not help at all. If you go to Exodus 6:16 through 20, again, we've covered Exodus 6 before, but this is when you get this sort of intrusive genealogy about the Levites, after God has made a concession to Moses, as far as bringing Aaron into the picture and all that, you get this weird genealogy just sort of plopped in here that we've talked about before. Okay, now catch this. This is from Heiser's book on hard sayings of the Old Testament. He actually has this as one of his entries. He writes, on his treatment of this passage. The list of 4 generations in this text presents no problems on its face until one reads in Exodus 12:40 that the time period is 430 years. Such genealogical lists in the Old Testament have been a source of special delight and enormous difficulty. I'm going to stop there. Let me read verses 16 through 20, and you'll get why this matters for the 430. Here's what we read. These are the names of the sons of Levi according to their generations. Now, Levi was one of the 12 offspring of Jacob who went with Jacob into Egypt. Okay, so we're right at the beginning point now of the sojourn, or the time of Israel in Egypt, 430. Okay? So these are the names of the sons of Levi according to their generations. Gershon, Kohath, and Merari, the years of the life of Levi being 137 years. The sons of Gershon, he lists the sons of Gershon. Verse 18, the sons of Kohath, and he gives the list. The sons of Merari, and he gives the list. Then he says, these are the clans of the Levites according to their generations. Amram, who was one of the sons of Kohath. Amram took as his wife Jochebed, his father's sister, and she bore him Aaron and Moses. The years of the life of Amram being 137 years. So we've got 4 generations written about here. We've got Levi, of course, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. You could say Gershon, Kohath, and Merari plus Amram. Maybe that's the 4th generation, whatever. You've clearly gone from the time the Israelites get into Egypt to the time of Moses and Aaron. And you got these 4 generations, okay? Now let's go back here, because Heiser sees a problem. He says, the difficulty is that all too many interpreters have been tempted to assume that these genealogies are complete lists of names and figures, and that we can therefore add up all the ages and obtain absolute dates for a number of pre-patriarchal events for which we otherwise would have no data. Unfortunately, this assumption is faulty. These are not complete genealogical records, and it was not the writer's intention to provide this material for readers who might wish to add up numbers. Usually the text is reluctant to do this. We must be reluctant to do it as well. So we must ask, is there evidence that these genealogies were condensed? Okay. What he's going to do here is let me just skip down here a little bit here. I might as well just read the whole thing. It's not that long. He says here, is there evidence these genealogies were condensed through the omission of less important names? In particular, can we determine whether there were only 4 generations? Here's the key question. Were there only 4 generations from Levi to Moses during the 430 years of bondage in Egypt? Sub-question, were Amram and Jochebed Aaron and Moses' immediate parents? If not, why does the text say Jochebed bore him, to Amram, Aaron, and Moses? On the other hand, why does Exodus 2:1 remain non-committal about the names of Moses' parents? Quote, now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman. She became pregnant, gave birth to the son, Moses. A parallel genealogy. Here's the problem. A parallel genealogy for the same period of time, from the days just before Jacob went to Egypt until his descendants came out 430 years later, is preserved in the line of Joshua, a younger contemporary of Moses. And it's given in 1 Chronicles 7:23 through 27. Yeah, 1 Chronicles is good for something, folks. Here it is. In that line, there are 11 generations listed between Jacob and Joshua. And so what Heiser's saying is the genealogy that we read in Exodus 6 has to be abbreviated and condensed. It has to be select. It's not going to be reliable to just add up years to get time intervals and event intervals. You got 11 generations and 4 generations. It's dramatically different. It's not like just one extra, okay, maybe they had an extra kid when she was a little bit younger. No, it's 11 generations between Jacob and Joshua. The logical conclusion, Heiser writes, is that Moses' genealogy is condensed. It is inconceivable that there should be 11 links between Jacob and Joshua and only 4 or maybe 5 between Jacob and Moses. If more proof is needed, we have it. An altogether overwhelming set of data can be seen in Numbers 3, 19, and 27 and 28. If no abridgment is understood in the 4 generations of Moses' ancestry, catch this, what results is this unbelievable set of numbers. The grandfather of Moses had, during Moses' lifetime, 8,600 male descendants. And we're forgetting that doesn't include the girls. Okay? 2,750 of whom were between the ages of 30 and 50, according to Numbers 4:36. Now, all of us know that these were times of large families, but is it possible to make sense of what has been reported in these texts unless there is a considerable condensing and compression of the record to get at just the key characters? Another piece of evidence is to be found in the fact that Levi's son Kohath was born before Jacob, and his 12 sons went down to Egypt, according to Genesis 46:11, where the emerging nation of Israel lived for 430 years. Now, if Moses was 80 years old at the Exodus, according to Exodus 7:7, he must have been born 350 years after Kohath, who, as a consequence, could not have been his grandfather. In fact, Kohath is said to have lived a total of 133 years, and his son Amram lived 137 years. These two numbers do not add up to the 350. Okay? I mean, he goes on to just point out how if you don't understand that the 4 generations of Exodus 6 are selective, and you take those names in those 4 generations, and you go into the book of Numbers, where these people are found, and they're having kids and other kids that aren't mentioned here, and there's other generations, it becomes a numerical set of absurdities. You say, well, what's the point, Mike? The point is that I brought this into the discussion because, in part, to set up next week. So we're going to end here. The issue is doing biblical chronology and arriving at dates for events is not as simple as looking in the Bible for numbers and just getting out a calculator and adding them all up. Let's be honest, few people care about the book of Numbers and the genealogical lists of First Chronicles. But there is stuff in there that will mess your chronological approach up big time. It will turn it into a house of cards, because that's what it is. So again, I offer this as a cautionary tale leading up to our discussion of the dates, the big two, the early date and late date, because some of that's going to involve how do we understand generations? How do we understand we take numbers literally or not? So in this episode, what we've got is we've got instances of numerical symmetry that makes potentially the numbers somewhat artificial. In other words, they are what they are because the writer wants to unite two sets of things together intentionally for the reader. And we also have, again, a cautionary tale about assuming certain things about genealogical lists when you get into chronology. It is not that simple. It will get you into trouble. It will lead you to false conclusions. So again, with that said, we've just dipped our toe into the issues here. So next time, we're going to build on this and get into the chronology, early and late date. How are they defended, and how does each side respond to each other?
Mike, did you mention which side you come down on all this?
My honest answer is I just don't know. There are things that tug me in both directions. It's really difficult. I'll just give you an example. One of the things that makes the late date unattractive to me are the disconnects with Joseph and the Hyksos period. They really are disconnected. So I don't quite know. There are always ways, to deal with that, but they're just things that sort of stick out. But on the other hand, the late date does have a number of things that really kind of make sense. Like in this episode, it could allow you to just go with the Septuagint. You don't have to, but you could. There's a whole bigger issue of when they actually get into the conquest, does the description of the geography of the land, what does that look like? Does it look like what we know from archaeology? And I'm not talking about the conquest of like Jericho. I'm talking just about the general settlement, patterns. Does it look more like the 13th century or the 14th century? And you can make a good argument that the boundaries of the cities and all that stuff really look a lot like the 13th century based on Telemarna texts, because Egypt used to be in control of this whole region, and there's actually a lot of records for towns and villages and stuff like that. But is that just evidence of it being written later or updated? Is it editorial? Who knows? I just don't know. I don't really know where to land. So yeah, that all kidding aside, now we are going to spend the episode on the date of the Exodus as I telegraphed last time. And so what I decided to do on the web page for this episode, there are going to be links to several articles. The two main ones I'm going to mention here in a moment. But I figured what I would do for this is interact with a fairly recent. It's 10, 15 years old. These are 10 years old or so. Some recent treatments of the date of the Exodus that appeared in theological journals. And it's nice that back in 2007, the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society had both sides, had scholars who take different views. They both wrote essays, and they're responsive to each other as well on this topic. So what I'm going to do is interact with both of these, and I'll bring a few other things in, where it matters. But all of these articles are going to be accessible to listeners if you want to go up and read them for yourself. I'm going to basically go through 5 sort of points that get discussed in these articles, and you'll be able to see who takes what side and how they respond to the other side, and what the arguments mean, how they're presented, how they defend their respective views. So for listeners who maybe didn't catch the earlier episodes when we talked about chronology, or are just not sort of up on this topic at all, maybe they've never looked at it. The date of the Exodus. Well, what's that about? There are 2 main dates. There are more than 2 views of this, but the 2 major positions are what has become known as the early date, that is 1446 BC, and a guy like Bryant Wood, who has his PhD from the University of Toronto in Syro-Palestinian archaeology. Bryant is an evangelical. I happen to know him. He is an early dater. He would be representative, and so I will be referencing him and his article, which is entitled "The Biblical Date for the Exodus is 1446 BC, a response to James Hoffmeyer." That is in the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society, again, back in 2007. Link to that on the episode page. So naturally, the other side is going to be Jim Hoffmeyer. He's going to hold the late date, which typically, you'll see that sort of pegged at sometime between 1270 and 1260 BC. So not quite 200 years later than the early date. Jim Hoffmeyer teaches at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He also has his PhD from the same institution as Bryant Wood, the University of Toronto. But Hoffmeyer's degree is in Egyptology. So his article is entitled, "What is the Biblical Date of the Exodus? A Response to Bryant Wood." Okay, so they go back and forth in the same issue of the journal. And that's how I'm going to proceed through this topic. I'm going to take 5 items of argumentation that both sides will interact with. And then at the end, listeners can draw their own conclusions about which arguments were better, or however they want to look at it. And I'll mix in a few of my own gut responses, to arguments and attempted rebuttals of those arguments as we go on. There are points where I think the rebuttals on both sides are kind of weak or not. Can certainly be, I would put the label uncertain on them, which means, if we were keeping score, the side that they were trying to rebut, we get a point on my scorecard. But I'm not going to keep points to the episode. You can keep points if you want. We're just going to go through the material. So the first, item for discussion would be these 2 verses, considered in tandem: 1 Kings 6:1 and Exodus 12:40. So this is item number 1, these 2 verses. Now, the Wood article, obviously he's going to take 1 Kings 6:1 as kind of a basic starting point. That's the verse. I'm just going to read it to listeners. It says this: "In the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began," that is Solomon, "to build the house of the Lord." So this places basically, if you take this at face value, it says in the 4th year of Solomon, when he began to build the temple, that was 480 years removed from the Exodus. So it's just a simple mathematical thing. Now, the date of Solomon's accession to the throne is really not disputed. Again, I've made the comment before. When you get down past 1000 BC, especially when the Bible starts to interact with Assyrian kings, the Assyrian chronology is a lot more secure than Egyptian chronology. It's astronomically based, with sure techniques, very well understandable, correlatable techniques with modern astronomical tools. So it's just a matter of finding, linchpins with Assyrian rulers and biblical figures, and then you can start to build a chronology for the Bible. And so Solomon's reign, the dates of it are really not controversial at all. Just about everybody's going to agree, within a plus or minus a year, that Solomon came to the throne in roughly 970 BC. That would make his fourth year 966 BC, because we're going in the lesser direction, because this is BC dating. So 966, go back 480 years, and you have 1446 BC. That would be your date of the Exodus. So that's a really simple thing. Now, we've talked about that number before. We also talked about Exodus 12:40 in the last episode. The time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. So what Wood says in his article, this is sort of where he starts, and he writes as follows. And he's specifically commenting at this point on Exodus 12:40. Although the Septuagint data differ from the Masoretic text at some points, and again, we talked about that in the last episode, the Septuagint certainly does not support a 13th century Exodus date. Okay, let me just stop there. So Wood's saying, look, I know all about Exodus 12:40. If you recall the end of the last episode, I had a quote from Hoffmeyer there, where Hoffmeyer says, look, if we take the 430 from the Septuagint, and we should, because Paul uses the Septuagint when he talks about Moses and Sinai, he has the same number, 430, even though, again, recall that Paul loops Abraham in there, and Exodus 12:40 in the Septuagint doesn't actually do that by name. But anyway, Hoffmeyer would say, look, if you're going to take the Septuagint seriously, and you've got that number of 430, and it includes, some of the patriarchal era, in that number with the date of the bondage and all, or the duration of the bondage and all that. Hoffmeyer said, lots of people have noticed that 430 is neatly divisible into 215 and 215. So Hoffmeyer and others would argue that the sojourn in Egypt, the period of affliction, is 215 years, and then the 215 years prior to that, you got the two sides of your equation there. So that's how they would do chronology. And Wood is saying, look, I know all about that, but just because we have this number, this 430 number, that doesn't actually tell us where to put that number in terms of what century the Exodus occurs. And he's right there. It doesn't really tell you where to put it. Hoffmeyer says if you take the 215 and the 215, again, the way he and many other scholars want you to take it, you wind up with Joseph being back in the Hyksos period. Again, if the first half of the 215, the second half, if the dividing line between those two, is the before affliction, after affliction, if that's the way we should look at that, then Hoffmeyer says there's no other conclusion to draw. Joseph was in the Hyksos period, and that's going to work with other arguments that he has. And Wood is saying, well, the verse doesn't actually say any of that. It doesn't tell us how to use the 430. And then Wood goes on and he says, now, there's too much assumed from the math anyway. And so he references an article by Ray, which I also have linked on the episode page. And Ray basically has a number of arguments about this number 430 and what can and cannot be said from it. So the general way to summarize this is Ray agrees, look, we're making too much of the math. Who cares if it's neatly divided into two halves of 215? Why do we assume that 430 is 430 to give us a 250-year pre-affliction and affliction? Why do we make these assumptions? So Ray presents a panoply of arguments about why this is not a necessary conclusion for the number 430. But I'll simplify to what I think to be the most significant problem that Ray notes, or at least the objection. He writes this. He says, it will be pertinent to begin our analysis with the two Old Testament passages that are the most relevant to our discussion. Exodus 12:40, because remember Ray's article is about the number 430 in this passage, and Genesis 15:13 through 21. Again, that should be familiar from the previous episode of the podcast. Ray writes, the former is given within a chronological statement in the context of the account of the Exodus itself. The latter, that is Genesis 15, is in the setting of God's ratification of his covenant with Abraham, because that's what Genesis 15 is about. Now, again, Genesis 15 included both the confirming of the promises of the seed, Ray points out, that's verses 13 and 17, or through 17, and then the land grant, verses 18 through 21. So he's saying, look, there's a context for these two passages, and Genesis 15 actually gives us the number of 400, whereas Exodus 12:40 gives us 430, but the context for both are different. And again, I should remind you of what the Septuagint actually says here at this point, because Ray is going to do something with this. So if you're reading the Septuagint, at least one edition of the Septuagint, you would read this at Exodus 12:40. Now the sojourn of the children of Israel during which they dwelt in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan was 430 years. Now Ray points out that even if we accept the 430 years with the Septuagint in that verse, and even if we accept the Septuagint's inclusion of to sort of loop Abraham in there, even if we sort of assume that, and then we seek to define the sojourn as part of this, as an equal half, 215. Even if we do that, like all the late daters want us to do that, we still have a contradiction with Genesis 15:13 through 16. Genesis 15:13 is very plain. I'm going to read it to you. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. So we have a problem. If we take Exodus 12:40 and we explain the 430 as including the patriarchs, we go with the Septuagint. If we, with Hoffmeyer, would argue, along with Ray, if we say that 430 is to be split in half and gives us a 215-year duration of the affliction, which puts Joseph in the Hyksos period rather nicely for the late date and works out, with Ramses on the other side as being the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Even if we let him do all that, there's still a question that remains. You have a 215-year affliction now, but Genesis 15:13 says point blank, it was 400 years. So you're barely over half for an affliction of what this other verse outside of Exodus 12:40 says. It's a plain contradiction. So again, Genesis 15:13, basically they would argue, Wood and Ray would argue that it defies the math imposed on the 430 years of Exodus 12:40. And the only way to avoid this obvious contradiction is to take the 430 and not divide it into 215, but to divide it another way. So here's how you would do it. The way to avoid this is to take the 430, then have the reference to dwelling in the land of Canaan in the Septuagint of Exodus 12:40 as having to do just with Jacob. His time in Canaan, like the good years in Egypt. So Jacob's time in Canaan plus the good times in Egypt while Joseph was alive, and then followed by a period of affliction. Now Jacob lived in Egypt for 17 years. We know that because of Genesis 47:28. It says that, which would then leave 413. So 430 minus 17, 413 for the affliction. And so the 400 of Genesis 15 could be viewed as a rounded off number. I mean, that's workable. But that's a problem for Paul's apparent use of Exodus 12:40, since he loops Abraham into the picture in Galatians 3:16 and 17. We spent a lot of time talking about this in the last episode. He says the law came 430 years after the promises were made to, not to Jacob, but to Abraham. So Paul links the 430 with Abraham. Very plain language there in Galatians. There's just no way to divide the 430 into two halves of 215 and have Abraham be in the picture, which is what Paul does. And this must mean for Ray and for Wood and the early date that Paul is not reading the 430 years the way that the late daters do. So this is part of Wood's argument. He's saying, look, I know all about the Exodus 12:40 thing, but it doesn't help you. It actually creates problems for the late date, with other verses. It creates problems with Genesis 15. So after referring to Ray to criticize the math of Exodus 12:40, Wood writes this: the key chronological data for determining the date of the Exodus are 1 Kings 6:1, Judges 11:26, which we'll get to, and 1 Chronicles 6:33 through 37. Judges 11:26 and 1 Chronicles 6:33 through 37 are the same in both the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, while, as Hoffmeyer points out, 1 Kings 6:1 is 440 years in the Septuagint rather than the 480 years in the Masoretic text. If one chooses to utilize the Septuagint reading of 1 Kings 6:1, the Exodus still falls in the 15th century, not the 13th century. So Wood's saying, look, I'll concede you the use of the Septuagint in Exodus 12:40, but I'm going to insist that you don't impose math on it. Okay, and you still have to deal with Paul's inclusion of Abraham. And I'll even let you have the Septuagint in 1 Kings 6:1, because if you take off another 40 years, then you still have the Exodus in 1406 BC, not 1446. So he's like, but this can work for me. If I can take the Septuagint, just like you want me to, Jim, and I can still come out with a late date because I'm not going to impose artificial math on Exodus 12:40, because if I do that, it creates contradictions with Genesis 15. So what Wood is trying to do here is neutralize or eviscerate the Septuagint appeal to Exodus 12:40 that the late daters will invariably use to defend their system. And of course, Hoffmeyer is one of these. So this is how he does it. And for Wood, 1 Kings 6:1 ultimately is a benchmark date to be taken at face value, whether you use the Masoretic text or the Septuagint. It's either 480 or 440, and the numbers mean what they say. So now for Hoffmeyer on the other side, if you've scrunched the affliction down to 215, that's going to affect the way you look at 1 Kings 6:1 and your whole system. The 215 putting Joseph in the Hyksos period, having, as we're going to see, having the Ramses of Exodus 1:11 be Ramses II. There's no way that you can get 480 years, literal years, between the fourth year of Solomon and the time of Ramses II. So, Hoffmeyer is going to have to do, and all late daters have to not take 1 Kings 6:1 at face value. The 480 doesn't mean 480. It's symbolic of something. And Wood, of course, knows this, but he's saying, look, I can take the Septuagint. Doesn't matter. We need to take the numbers at face value here in both these verses. The math you impose on Exodus 12:40 creates problems for you, and Wood is ultimately going to object to making 480 symbolic. He continues, well, this is me now. Again, Hoffmeyer, when he's forced to deal with the 480 of 1 Kings 6:1, he'll say, look, it's very obvious that 480 is divisible. It's 12 times 40. And 40 is typically the number for a generation. When one, a son gets married and starts having children, 40, that's like a generation. And there's 12. That would be, it's a symbolic number, 12 generations of 40, 12 tribes of Israel. So he's like, there's obvious symbolism here. So Hoffmeyer, again, views the 480 years as symbolic. And since he doesn't need to take it literally, and he does need to have Joseph in the Hyksos period, and he does need and wants, Ramses II to be the Pharaoh of the Exodus, he's actually pretty precise. He'll actually date the Exodus to precisely 1267 BC. Hoffmeyer believes that the Hebrew slaves were used in the construction of the new capital of Ramses II's capital. And so since he connects those two things, he can be pretty precise, as far as the dating. So that's his date, 1267. Now, again, Wood knows all of this. This is sort of the basic beginning point for the entire discussion. What do we do with 1 Kings 6:1? Does 480 mean 480? How can it not, how can it mean 480 if you want to take a late date like this? Because 1 Kings 6:1 mentions the fourth year of Solomon. Everybody knows when that was. It was 966. You do the math. There's no way you wind up at 1267. You wind up at 1446 BC. So everybody knows that the late daters are going to take 480 as a symbolic number. They're going to use Exodus 12:40, especially with the Septuagint, to work out, or to align, with that scenario. And Wood's saying, look, I'm not opposed to the Septuagint. I'm opposed to your math. And there's just no way that this is going to work if we take the number at face value. But I know you don't take the number at face value, and I just think that's the wrong method. So what Wood tries to do to argue that this is the wrong way to look at the numbers, he does a few things. Let me just read a little bit from him. So Wood, again, is writing of Hoffmeier's position, of the late date position. He says, it's not feasible to fit the events of Exodus 1:11 to 12:36 in a 3-year time span. Now, let me stop there. Wood says, okay, not only do I object with the way you symbolize 480, but if you want to pinpoint the Exodus to 1267 BC, like 3 years after Ramses II gets to the throne, and this is what Exodus 1 is about. It's about this building program of Ramses, and he uses the Israelites in there. If you want to argue that, then what you're forced to do is you have to read the entirety of Exodus 1 all the way through Exodus 12, all the way up to the Passover. You have to read all that as happening in 3 years. And late daters do. They do have to do that. So Wood says it's just not feasible to fit the events of Exodus 1:11 to chapter 12, verse 36 in a 3-year time span. Following the building of Pithom and Ramses, the Israelites experienced a growth in population. Wood quotes Exodus 1:12. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, which had to have taken place over a considerable period of time. This was followed by an escalation of the oppression, Exodus 1:13 and 14. Next, the king decreed that the male Hebrew babies should be put to death, Exodus 1:15 through 19. When the midwives ignored the order, the people increased and became even more numerous. That's Exodus 1:20, again indicating a long passage of time. So Wood's like, how in the world can all that happen in 3 years? And honestly, it does seem hard to believe, for me anyway, that one could place these items in a 3-year span, as Hoffmeier's view of the late date requires. And Wood asserts that, this would be obvious, that the early date doesn't give you any of these problems. It gives you plenty of time. Now, of the symbolic view of 480, Wood writes this. The second major premise of the 13th century model, again, the late date, is that the 480 years of 1 Kings 6:1 is in reality, quote, a symbolic number that derives from 12 times 40, 40 years being a symbolic number for a generation, unquote. Hoffmeier does not comment on the fact that 1 Chronicles 6:33 through 37 indicates that there were 19 generations from the time of Moses to the time of Solomon, not 12. Hoffmeier's treatment of the 40 years as a generation, again, is even more problematic, as he himself demonstrated by his partial list of the occurrences of 40 years in the Hebrew Bible, which Wood provides in full. The use of the number is always associated with an elapsed period of time in the history of Israel and never as a generation. Now, what Wood means here is that the number 40 is used of reigns and other occasions in Israel's history to represent a specific period of time. It's never clearly, he would say, symbolic for a generation. Now, Wood gives a complete list of the occurrences of the number 40 in an earlier article against the late date. And there's also a link to this one on the episode page. It's called The Rise and Fall of the 13th Century Exodus Conquest Theory. Now, the comeback to this, Hoffmeyer would say, and I think this is an obvious comeback, he would say, come on, doesn't it strike you as odd that so many things happen in 40s? The writer may not have to explain to the reader that 40 isn't about a precise counting of years, but the elapse of a generation. Okay, yeah, there's literally 19 generations between Moses and Solomon. Good for First Chronicles, okay, good. But that isn't what Hoffmeyer is arguing. He's not arguing against that. He's not saying the number 19 is wrong there. He's saying this number in 1 Kings 6:1, 480 is symbolic because 40s happen everywhere. And it's just so odd. If that represents like an actual time period, it's just kind of incredible that everything happens in units of 40. So to Hoffmeyer, the fact that so many things happen in units of 40, and I'm going to read you the list, it just seems like 40 must mean something different. There must be a reason why the writers keep using 40, because it just feels artificial that everything would be literally happening in units of time of 40 years. Like it's just so odd because there's so many of them. And, Hoffmeyer would reference things like in Matthew, Jesus' genealogy. Everybody knows this is an artificial genealogy in terms of its structure, 14, 14, 14. I mean, everybody knows this. Nobody argues about this. So Hoffmeyer's saying, look, sometimes when it's not that these people are not historical. It's just that the way that the time of these generations, their span, it gets talked about in an intentionally symbolic way. And since 40 is just so ubiquitous, it just seems like that's the right way to take it. So again, that's in a nutshell what Hoffmeyer would come back with. He'd say, look, the writer knew this. The readers would have known this. They know that it's not about a specific chronology. There's something else going on here. There's some symbolic meaning to this. Now the following is from Wood's list. Wood is the writer between the two that gives you the grocery list of all the things that happen in 40. So here's this little, he has it in a footnote in that one article I just mentioned. So here are the things, that he lists. And just ask yourself, do all these things happening in 40s give the impression of literal coincidence or artificial sort of symbolic use? I mean, that's the question, Dan. That's the question a late dater would pose, to you. So here's Wood's footnote. During the flood, it rained for 40 days and nights. I'm going to leave the verse references out just to get through it. During the flood, it rained for 40 days and nights. 40 days after the ark landed, Noah sent out a raven. Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, as was Esau when he married Judith. The embalming of Jacob took 40 days. The spies spent 40 days in Canaan. Joshua was 40 when he went with the spies to Canaan. Israel spent 40 years in the wilderness. Moses was on Mount Sinai 40 days and nights, the first time he received the law, as he was the second time. Moses fasted 40 days and nights for the sin of the golden calf. There were 40 years of peace during the judgeships of Othniel, Deborah, and Gideon. The Israelites were oppressed by the Philistines 40 years. Eli judged Israel 40 years. Ishbosheth was 40 when he took the throne following Saul's death. David reigned for 40 years, as did Solomon. Elijah traveled 40 days and nights from the desert of Beersheba to Mount Horeb. Ezekiel lay on his right side for 40 days for the 40 years of the sins of Judah. Ezekiel predicted that Egypt would be uninhabited for 40 years. And Jonah preached that Nineveh would be overturned in 40 days. Okay, that's the end of Wood's footnote. Now, there's a lot of stuff happening in 40s. Again, the question is, and Hoffmeyer would say, look, it just strikes me as too coincidental to believe that all of these uses of 40s are supposed to be understood as literal, progression of time, 40 years, 40 days, whatever it is. And we haven't even gotten into the multiples of 40, like, the 480 is for 1 Kings 6:1. So Hoffmeyer says, look, there's a lot of other things that really indicate that the Exodus occurred during the time of Ramses II. And if that is the case, then not only does it seem like we should take 1 Kings 6:1, the 480 there, as symbolic, but we really have to. And that brings us to the second content item, Exodus 1:11 and Ramses. So if for early daters, the 480 of 1 Kings 6:1 is like kind of a linchpin argument, if that's the case, and it is, for that view. And because, again, they'll argue that if you don't look at it that way, you've got these other chronological problems that develop. Since that is the linchpin argument for them, this is the linchpin argument for the late date. And so here we go, Exodus 1:11 and Ramses. Now, we've had a whole episode on this before, and but basically the scholarly infighting that goes on over this. Wood obviously rejects the idea that the Ramses, Ra'amses in Exodus 1:11 is Ramses II. Wood rejects that. Wood views Ramses or Ra'amses in the verse as a place name updating. If you remember that from the earlier episode, it says, Ramses there because a later editor put it there. It changed an older name that the place would have been named, during the early date of the Exodus, before Ramses, was born, before we had a Ramesside dynasty. It was called something else, Avaris, Tanis Avaris, that whole area. And so later on, an editor changed the name to Ramses so that his readers would know what in the world, what geographical place we were even talking about, because it did change again in real time. And so the Bible had to be editorial updated in terms of this place name. So that's Wood's view. Now, Hoffmeyer raises some objections to this, because this is a real linchpin issue for the late date. And I'm going to go through a couple of these. He says, first, in places in the Hebrew Bible where a place name is updated, there is consistently formulaic language of explanation by the biblical writer. I'm going to read you a few of these and see if you can detect a pattern to your ear. Genesis 14:12. These kings made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinav, king of Admah, Shem-Ever, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. So Bela, the place, he's saying, in other words, Zoar. Genesis 14:3. And all these joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. So again, it's an editorial about the place. Genesis 14:7. They turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh. En Mishpat, that is, in other words, Kadesh. Okay, Genesis 23:2. Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Genesis 28:19. He called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the place was Luz at the first. So of the 5 instances, and I just read you the 5, Hoffmeyer says, of the 5 instances in which the Old Testament has, or I didn't read you these 5, it happened 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, this is a different 5 Hoffmeyer is referring to here, so I don't want to create confusion. He says, of the 5 instances in which the Old Testament has the name Ramses as a toponym is a place name. He says none of those instances has any of this formulaic explanatory language. So here's his argument. He's like, look, Bryant, I know that biblical writers do update place names. I get it. But when they do that, there will be the language of explanation when they do it. So-and-so, that is this place. They call the place this, but unto this day it's that. I mean, there's some sort of explanatory formulaic language, usually that is, or in other words, going on. Every time Ramses as a name occurs in the Old Testament, none of that happens. And so consequently, Hoffmeyer argues that this is not an editorial updating. He argues that the name Ramses, again in the Hebrew Ra'amses, is not an updating. It is one of the pharaohs named Ramses. And Hoffmeyer argues on the basis of where they're at in the Delta and the slavery and all that kind of stuff. He argues that it's Ramses II. So that's his first challenge to Wood. Where's the formulaic language? Where does the biblical writer explain this as an updating? Oh, they don't. So why are you calling it an updating? Oh, I know why you're calling it an updating. Because you need to. You can't have the Pharaoh of the Exodus be Ramses II because you're taking the 480 in 1 Kings 6:1 at face value. There's no way you can live with the Pharaoh or with the name Ramses in Exodus 1:11 actually be Ramses II. You have to get rid of that. Second, Hoffmeyer charges that the editorial updating argument fails for inconsistency in another respect. Here's what he writes in his article. He says, quote, if the text was changed from an earlier name, such as Avaris, to Ramses, then why was the name not subsequently updated to Zoan, Tanis, the Deltic capital that replaced P. Ra'amses around 1070 BC and prospered into Roman times? Now, let me stop there. He's saying, look, if you're arguing that a later editor took the name Avaris, got rid of it, put in Ramses, Well, guess what, Bryant? Ramses didn't stay the name of that place. It changed again 200 years later. So why didn't the biblical writers after 1070 BC, like during the time of David somewhere, or the monarchy, why didn't they change it again? Back to Hofmeyr, he says Zoan or Tanis and not Ramses is used by Asaph in Psalm 78 when he describes the miraculous deeds that resulted in the Exodus. Now, I'm going to read that again because that's really important. He says, look, we know that some editor did do that. They did note the second change to the place name Zoan from Ramses to Zoan because it shows up in the Bible. So why didn't, if there's an editor fiddling around with Exodus 1:11, why didn't that editor also put Zoan in Exodus 1:11? If he didn't want readers to be confused that this wasn't the Pharaoh Ramses, it wasn't named after that Pharaoh at that time of the Pharaoh. Because elsewhere in the Old Testament, they do put Zoan in there. They do update it. And here, he mentions Psalm 78, and it's verse 12. Here's the quote of the verse. In the sight of their fathers, he, God, wrought marvels in the land of Egypt, in the fields of Zoan. Again, writes Hofmeyr, in Psalm 78:43, the fields of Zoan is mentioned, followed by a reference to 6 of the 10 plagues. Psalm 78:44 through 51. So plainly, during the first half of the first millennium BC, when Psalm 78 was composed, and P. Ram Esses, the city stores, of Ramses there from Exodus 1:11, that place, when that place, P. Ramses, had ceased to exist some centuries earlier, Asaph, the biblical writer, used Zoan because it was the Delta capital. If the 5 references to Ramses represent an updated toponym, one would expect to find Zoan or Tanis in those places, because that was occupied for more than a millennium, not the short-lived Ramses name. Now, Wood responds this way, and I'm going to be honest with you. I think this response is weak. I think Hofmeyr's point is really interesting, and it's a good comeback. It's a good comeback to the editorial updating position, but Wood responds this way. Again, you might think this is good, but this just feels like it falls short a little bit. Wood says, Hofmeyr questions why the biblical text was not updated with the name Zoan or Tanis, the capital of the Delta from circa 1070 BC to the Roman period. The short answer is that Zoan at Tanis was not located at the site where the Israelites lived, but 19 kilometers to the northeast. Comparing the name Ramses in Exodus and Numbers with Zoan in Psalm 78 is mixing apples and oranges. The references in Exodus 1:11, 12:37, Numbers 33:3, and Numbers 33:5 are contemporary references specific to the place where the Israelites lived, later called Ramses. Psalm 78, on the other hand, is a retrospective view that transpired in the vicinity of, but not at, the location where the Israelites once lived. So that's the end of Wood's quote. So Wood links his rebuttal entirely to the place where they lived and where they didn't live, like just a nearby area. To me, that feels weak because the references in Psalm 78 to the plagues that use the term Zoan, can we really be that specific with the plagues? It just doesn't feel strong to me. I mean, if I were Wood here, I would hope I could come up with something better than this. But be that as it may, I mean, I'm not saying Wood's wrong. I mean, he could be right. It just doesn't feel as strong as I'd like it to be. So what you have here is you really can't overstate the importance of Exodus 1:11, not only for the late date, but for the whole question. If Ramses in Exodus 1:11 and these 4 other passages refers to Ramses II, then there is no debate. The late date is obvious. So that is the linchpin for the late date position, just like 480 is for the early date. And again, the chronological problems alternatives might create. That's the linchpin for the early date. This is the linchpin issue for the late date. Well, now, if you recall our earlier episode, there was an Egyptologist, a very prominent one, Donald Redford, who didn't buy that Ramses was a reference to the Pharaoh in Exodus 1:11. We talked about Redford's skepticism in that earlier episode. He just doesn't buy into it. Hofmeyr opposes Redford's skepticism. Naturally, that's no surprise. He doesn't think Redford is correct. He thinks it is Pharaoh Ramses II. And Hofmeyr cites other prominent Egyptologists that don't buy into Redford's objections either. One example is John Currid, and I've read from Currid's book in previous episodes. Currid is a late dater, and this is what Currid writes about this whole issue. Another problem in attempting to identify Ramses was outlined by Donald Redford in 1963. He argued that the biblical Ramses could not be the Delta capital of the Ramessides because the latter was called Per-Ramses in Egyptian texts. And he quotes Redford here. Is Ramses to be equated with Ramses II's new capital? Because in Exodus 1:11, it's Pithom and Ramses. It's not Per-Ramses. This is, Redford is fixated on this. It's not the same name that you'd see in Egyptian texts as Redford's argument, so it can't be the same thing. It can't be the same place, and it's not named after the Pharaoh. So back to Currid. Currid says, let me see. Do I want to include Redford? Yeah, I'll include Redford's comment here. Is Ramses to be equated with Ramses II's new capital? The latter during the late New Kingdom bore the name Per-Ra-Mes-Su, and whence we would expect a Hebrew P-Ra-Amses. But biblical Ramses, that's not what we have. So the two names Redford says just seem to have nothing in common. Now back to Currid. Manfred Betak, Currid points out, has adequately answered Redford's challenge by demonstrating on the basis of earlier work by Sir Alan Gardner and Wolfgang Helck, those are again 2 other very famous Egyptologists, that the of Per-Ra-Mes-Su does indeed drop off in various grammatical situations. And so Currid concludes that the abbreviated form, just Ramses, could have easily transferred to another language. That's the end of the Currid quote. Now he's citing Beatock, Manfred Beatock, and some of you may be able to get this book in case you're interested on Beatock's rebuttals to Redford. It's from an essay in a book. The essay is called Comments on Exodus in the book Egypt, Israel, and Sinai, edited by A.F. Rainey. That's Rainey. That is available, so you can find it used on Amazon. So if you want that resource, you can get it. Huffmeyer further argues, quote, none of the geographical terms found in Exodus 1:11 and the root of the Exodus are known in Egyptian sources prior to the 13th century. Let me read that again. Huffmeyer says, look, the rebuttals to Redford's objections that Ramses in Exodus 1:11 cannot be Ramses the Great, Ramses II's royal residence. He says those objections have been answered by other Egyptologists. The per part of the name does drop off, and so the fact that it's just Ramses in Exodus 1:11 is no rebuttal. And then he adds, I'll read it again, quote, none of the geographical terms found in Exodus 1:11 and the root of the Exodus are known in Egyptian sources prior to the 13th century. Now that's pretty startling, because you'd think, again, you would think that wouldn't be true if we have an early date for the Exodus. Now you could argue against Mosaic authorship for the Exodus accounting. And you could say, well, somebody writing after the 13th century, when these place names existed, could be using these place names to tell the story of Moses. But the actual event would have happened in 1446 BC. You'd actually have to argue against Mosaic authorship at this point to hold the early date. Now, Wood actually doesn't want to do either. I'm telling you what I think is the most coherent. Wood says, look, Huffmeyer says none of these place names, these toponyms, are in Egyptian sources from the 13th, before the 13th century. That's an argument from silence. That's true, but again, to my ear, it's a little bit startling. Is that the same kind of argument from silence that we might object to in other things? Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't know, but that's all that Wood says. And I know Wood, and he's not going to argue against. I'm very, very. I don't know if I'm completely sure, but I'm really sure, pretty sure, that he would not argue against Mosaic authorship to save the early date bacon in this argument. Instead, he's just going to say that's an argument from silence. And that's what he does in his article. So I don't think he would go beyond that. So is that a good argument or not? No. Third item, Judges 11:26. Now Wood takes this number at face value just like he does 1 Kings 6:1. Let me read you the verse. This is Jephthah speaking, the judge. While Israel lived in Heshbon and its villages, and in Aroer and its villages, and in all the cities that are on the banks of the Arnon, 300 years, why did you not deliver them within that time? Now, if you don't recall the context for what's going on in Judges 11, this is Jephthah basically, I don't know if I want to say picking a fight, might be the right way to put it, with in the context of Moab, and he's saying, look, this is land, that doesn't belong to you, and so on and so forth. Israel has been in this place, this thing they're arguing about. We've been here for 300 years. Let me just pick up a few of the earlier verses. We'll start in verse 23. So then the Lord God of Israel dispossessed the Amorites from before his people Israel. Okay, the Amorites, again, this is another way of referring to the Rephaim specifically, but we'll just say the Canaanites here. It's a way of referring to the conquest. The Judges period is after the conquest under Joshua. So Jephthah says, hey, the Lord, the God of Israel, dispossessed the Amorites from before his people Israel. Are you going to take possession of them? Will you not possess what Chemosh, your God, gives you to possess? I mean, you got your own lands. Chemosh gave you those. This is ours. And all that the Lord our God has dispossessed before us, we will possess. It's our land. Now, are you any better than Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab? Did he ever contend against Israel, or did he ever go to war with them? While Israel lived in Heshbon and its villages, and in Aroer and its villages, and in all the cities that are on the banks of the Arnon, 300 years, why didn't you deliver them within that time? Again, he said, may the Lord, the judge, decide this day between the people of Israel and the people of Ammon. So, he's talking to the king of the Ammonites, and he's bringing up the king of Moab, he's bringing up Chemosh, the Amorites, and all this stuff. The bottom line for Judges 11:26 is that Jephthah says, and he's not the last judge, he's kind of in the middle. He says, look, we've been here 300 years. Now, Wood takes that number at face value. And if you do that, it requires there to be 300 years between the time of the conquest and the time of Jephthah. That would be logical. And for him to say that and take it at face value, he's saying, look, today is like 300 years since the conquest. Now, this is Jephthah, and there were 6 more judges, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, Samson, Eli, and we'll include Samuel here. He was the last judge. There were 6 more judges after Jephthah before we get to the beginning of Israel's first king, the monarchy, Saul. If we take the years of each of these judgeships at face value, we get from Jephthah to the life of Samuel, 103 years. So that means there needs to be roughly 400 years between the time of Moses, or let's just say, I was going to say Moses' death. Let's just say that the time of the conquest, okay? There has to be roughly 400 years between the time of the conquest and the time that Saul becomes king. Now, if the early date is right, the conquest under Joshua wrapped up circa 1406. Let's just call it 1400. 1400 BC. 400 years puts us to around 1000 BC, which it's workable. I mean, that's roughly the date for David's kingship. I mean, we got to squeeze Saul in there somehow. Because Saul reigned 40 years, David reigned 40 years, then Solomon, gets there in 970. So, we've got some number discrepancies there. We've got this 400-year period, doesn't quite, work, just numerically. And, people like Wood who take this number seriously at face value. They say, look, we can fiddle with the numbers here a little bit because various judges could be, and really ought to be, understood as ruling concurrently So we don't just take the numbers of the judges and string them one after the other. There were a number of judges that ruled at the same time, but in different parts of the promised land. So he's saying that some of this is going to overlap. And again, this is not really in dispute either. Everybody sort of recognizes this. So he's like, you can scrunch the chronology, the beginning of the monarchy, the end of the conquest, and what Jephthah said. You can make it work if you want to take the 300-year number at face value. But then he turns it on Hoffmeyer in the late date and says, so how are you going to make 300 years work? If you have the Exodus occurring in 1267, and then look at the dates associated, or the years associated with Moses, they wander around 40 years. Now we're down at 1227, and they get in the land. It's like estimates are 7 to 10 years, for the conquest. So 1227. Let's just call it 1220. You've got 120 years, okay, in theory at least, on paper, before the monarchy begins. But now you've got a 300-year number in Judges 11:26 to work with, to deal with, which is actually bigger. Again, if you add some of the judges, even if you take them as not linear, if there's some of these that are concurrent, you've got at least 300 years to compress into 120. How are you going to do that? So this is a big deal for the early date as well. Again, 1 Kings 6:1, they can live with the Septuagint in Exodus 12:40 as long as you don't impose math on it, a breakdown on it. And then Judges 11:26 is a big deal because Wood would just say plainly, Hoffmeyer has a serious problem here. The late date has a serious problem. Concurrent judgeships might be able to handle a 100-year overshot, but you have an overshot problem of more than twice that length. What are you going to do with that? Now, Hoffmeyer responds this way. This is how a late dater would respond. Quote, a literal understanding of certain large numbers may not always be correct if the authorial intent was not literal. Such misplaced literalism would be a misinterpretation of Scripture's meaning. Thus, Jephthah's statement that the Israelite tribes had occupied areas of the Transjordan 300 years earlier, since the days of Moses, or at least the end of Moses' life, could be a case of hyperbole that is intentionally exaggerating the time in order to strengthen his dispute with the Ammonites. That's the end of the quote. So Hoffmeyer is saying, look, Jephthah's exaggerating just to pick a fight or make a point with the king of the Ammonites. We should not take this literally. And Hoffmeyer is going to know, and we've had this discussion as well about the use of large numbers being hyperbole. But let's be honest here. I think the legitimate use of hyperbole with large numbers, we talked about the large number problem. Those are terms when you're talking about tens and hundreds of thousands, not 300. Okay, so that to me, this response on Hoffmeyer, I said the response of Wood earlier about the editorial updating Zoan was weak. I think this is weak. This really strikes me as a weak response, just an exaggeration. He has to say that. But again, if I were a late dater, I want more than this. It just has the feeling of, what else can I say? Just like earlier Wood, that's how it makes me feel. What else can I say? So there you go. So the early daters, again, really are going to push Judges 11:26 as being a number that we take at face value. Now you could also, to be fair to late daters, Hoffmeyer doesn't get into this, but you can say, look, Jephthah, really? We're getting information from Jephthah now. This is the guy who uttered the insane vow at the end of his judgeship and has to sacrifice his daughter. And I realize there's more than one view of that, but just work with me here. This is the guy that was such an idiot that he did that. Even in this passage, he refers to Chemosh as the god of the Ammonites. That wasn't their god. Chemosh was the god of Moab. It's in the Moabite stone. So Jephthah even gets that wrong. This is no scholar. He's a hack. He's just a judge and kind of a bad guy too, in the end, or a stupid guy. Yes, God used him, but he's a bit of a moron. So why should we take Jephthah's understanding of Israel's chronology seriously? He could just be throwing a number out there. I think essentially that's what Hoffmeyer argues. So you could dress it up a little bit, but at the end of the day, that's really that's the late that's the late date comeback. If I was a late dater, I would wish for a little bit more on that. I'd wish for something a little bit better. Item number 4, the lack of external reference to Israel in Canaan earlier than the 13th century BC. Now Hoffmeyer and other late daters argue that the earliest reference to Israel being in Canaan, in the Promised Land, the earliest external artifact, inscription, anything, the earliest external evidence we have for Israel even being in the Promised Land, which of course they would be after the Exodus, is the 13th century, specifically the Merentah or Merneptah, you'll see it spelled both ways, stela. Hoffmeyer explains, and you've probably seen a picture of this. This comes up all the time, with the book of Exodus and just generally biblical archaeology. Hoffmeyer writes, one of the major problems for the early date Exodus is the early date conquest. As one who has extensively studied texts relating to Egypt's military activity in Canaan from the 16th through the 14th centuries, I have been troubled by 2 problems, Hoffmeyer says. First, among the records of the warring kings of Egypt who had imperial control of Canaan and Syria from circa 1500 to 1200 BC, except for the Merentah stela, there is no reference to Israel or any of the tribes, despite the fact that several hundred toponyms are known for the region. Let me stop there. He's saying, look, Egyptian war chronicles, they use 700 place names from Canaan. They're familiar with Canaan, but there's only one reference, and it comes in the 1200s. There's only one reference to Israel or any of the tribes, just one. And so, Hoffmeyer is saying, that's a real problem for the early date. There's like nothing in the archaeological record about the people, while there is plenty in the archaeological record about the places. It sounds to me like the people aren't there yet, and the early date just doesn't work. Now, Hoffmeyer continues, and he says, Wood points to a recently published inscribed block by Manfred Georg, that's Gorgo with the umlaut, that is stored in the Berlin Museum as possible evidence of Israel's presence in Canaan in the 15th century. So, let me stop there. Wood brings up an artifact, and again, you have access on the episode webpage to this article about this artifact. Wood knows there's an artifact that has in theory, and I'll just tell you, I think it is real, okay? I think it's legit, that mentions Israel in an Egyptian artifact prior to the 13th century, specifically in the 15th century where you'd need it for the early day. So Hoffmeyer says, Wood brings up this object and this article by Manfred Georg. And he says, Georg's reading of this name as Israel is plagued by serious linguistic and orthographic problems that preclude it from being Israel. I shall address four, says Hoffmeyer. He does this in his article. I'm not going to get into hieroglyphs here and spellings and linguistic stuff, but you can go read that and maybe you'll get something out of it, maybe you won't. But to continue with Hoffmeyer, thus the only occurrence of Israel from ancient Egypt remains the Maranatha stele. He doesn't think Manfred Georg's artifact really says Israel. That's the issue. Does it include the term Israel or not in this artifact? He says, this is certainly unexpected, that we only have the Maranatha stela, since we possess scores of geographical text and toponym lists and hundreds of extant toponyms from Canaan from the 15th and 14th century, and yet neither Israel nor any of the tribal names is attested. For the period 1400 to 1250 BC, Egypt exercised hegemony over Canaan and Syria, so this silence is problematic for the early date Exodus and the conquest. Now again, Georg's article can be accessed on the episode webpage. It's actually co-authored with two other scholars. The names are Peter van der Veen, Christopher Theiss, or Thies, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, and Manfred Georg. And the title is Israel in Canaan, Long Before Pharaoh Merentah, ? A fresh look at Berlin statue pedestal relief 21687. That's in the Journal of Ancient Egyptian Interconnections, and this is a freely available article on the internet. Now, Georg has since responded to Hoffmeyer. Hoffmeyer is writing in 2007, don't forget. And so, Georg is aware of Hoffmeyer's criticisms that are in Hoffmeyer's article. So Georg has since responded to Hoffmeyer in a follow-up article, which unfortunately is only in German. And that is Manfred Georg, Israel in Hieroglyphen. That's in Biblische Notizen, which is a scholarly journal in biblical studies, but it's basically all in German. Way back in 2001. I mean, he and Hoffmeyer have been going back and forth before these present articles that we're citing. So Wood actually presents a summary of Georg's points, his rebuttals to Hoffmeyer, in his article available on the episode webpage. So if you have the Wood article, you'll see Georg's rebuttal to Hoffmeyer. Now, my 2 cents here, since Egyptian is one of the languages I've had several years of, I think Georg responds well to Hoffmeyer. Consequently, I don't think the notion that the Maranatha stela compels a late date for the Exodus. I don't think that's coherent at all. I think Georg's work and the work of these other two scholars is sound. I would say there really aren't any good linguistic problems with the spelling of what would be Israel in this pedestal. So I don't think Hoffmeyer has a rebuttal here at all. I think Georg handles it well, but that doesn't mean anything for the debate. Okay, now we have one artifact apiece with the name Israel in both time slots, 15th century, 13th century. Will that really help? Well, I guess it helps. Rebut Hoffmeyer's sort of insistence, the way he cast doubt on Israel being in Canaan. So it at least does that, but it doesn't flip the argument to, we've got to be early daters now because of Manfred Georg. No, it doesn't do any of that. It just says now we got one apiece. So take it for what it's worth. Number 5, the Pharaoh of the Exodus. This is our last content item for this episode. So the question is, did he survive the Red or Reed Sea incident? And by the way, the Hebrew text does have Reed Sea, not Red Sea. Yam Suf is Reed Sea. And we'll get to the terminology when we get there. So the question is, the Pharaoh of the Exodus, did he survive what happened at the Red Sea? I'll just use Red Sea now. Basically, the answer to this question affects the number of possible candidates among Egypt's pharaohs as to who could have been the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Whether this Pharaoh died in the sea or not, it would have been his firstborn son who died in the last plague. So it doesn't really matter if the Pharaoh dies or not. You're going to have people take sides on that. What really matters is that Pharaoh, did he lose his firstborn son? Another way of saying is, whether he was killed or survived, who took the throne next? If it wasn't the firstborn son of the guy, who either survived or died in the Red Sea? Well, that's kind of interesting. So the issue is really about the firstborn when it comes to deciding what Pharaoh we're dealing with here. Again, early daters aren't married to whether Pharaoh perished in the Red Sea or not. Wood believes that the Pharaoh did die in the Red Sea, and that this Pharaoh was Amenhotep II of the 18th dynasty. And Wood argues his point this way. Here's what he writes. Hoffmeyer doubts that the Pharaoh of the Exodus died in the Red Sea. A review of the pertinent text, however, suggests otherwise. In Exodus 14:18, the Lord told Moses that he would, quote, gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen, unquote. Then, after the Israelites had crossed the sea, quote, the Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea, Exodus 14:23. By the way, notice that it doesn't say Pharaoh's horse in there. Back to Wood. When Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, it returned to its place, quote, and the Lord swept them into the sea. He swept them into the sea. Psalm 136:15 uses the same language, but explicitly includes Pharaoh. So this is a little bit better. The Lord, quote, brought Israel through the midst of it, but swept Pharaoh and his army into the Yam Suf. Again, that sounds like Pharaoh's in there. The Egyptians were then engulfed in the returning waters, such that the entire army of Pharaoh perished, quote, not one of them survived. Exodus 14:28, Psalm 106:11. So Wood says a clear sequence is presented in these verses. 1, the waters are parted. 2, the Israelites cross on dry land. 3, the Egyptian army charges into the sea in pursuit of the Israelites. 4, while in the midst of the sea, the Egyptians, including Pharaoh, are thrown from their chariots as the waters returned. And 5, the entire army is engulfed by the returning waters. Wood writes, it is highly unlikely that Pharaoh, the one the Lord would gain glory through after being thrown from his chariot, somehow miraculously escaped the massive inundation of the returning waters of the Yam Suf. A straightforward reading of the biblical text implies that all of the pursuing Egyptians, including the king himself, drowned in the Yam Suf. I want you to remember that line. Wood says that the Pharaoh of the Exodus drowned in the Red or Reed Sea. Now, another scholar, Douglas Petrovich, also likes Amenhotep II as the Pharaoh of the Exodus, but he doesn't think that Pharaoh died in the Reed Sea. And he doesn't see that as a problem for biblical reliability when it comes to these verses that I just sort of truck through here that Wood uses. So Petrovich rebuts Wood's use of these passages as indicating Pharaoh's death. And you can go read Petrovich's article. Again, that's also accessible on the episode webpage. So, you got one early data that says Pharaoh died, another one says he didn't. Petrovich rebuts Wood's use again of these passages, noting that none of them actually says the Pharaoh died. I mean, the one says the Pharaoh gets swept away, but okay. He further points out how Amenhotep's reign length, now here this is a bigger issue. Petrovich points out how Amenhotep's reign length, this is Amenhotep II, cannot accommodate Wood's early date defense if Amenhotep II died. Since Petrovich doesn't think he died, he defends the Amenhotep II identification by different means, zeroing in on the fact that Amenhotep II's firstborn son was not his successor. Now, Hoffmeyer obviously doesn't think that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was Amenhotep II because his Exodus is like a couple hundred years later. It's a later dynasty. So Hoffmeyer writes this of Wood's identification of Amenhotep II being the Pharaoh of the Exodus. He says, there are several problems with this identification. First, Wood muddles Egyptian chronology by using the high chronology for the 18th dynasty. For example, he gives dates here. Ahmose, 1570 to 1546, Amenhotep II, 1453 to 1419. And Wood, he says Wood uses the high chronology for that part of the 18th dynasty, and he uses the low chronology for the 19th dynasty, the next dynasty, dating Ramses II to 1279 to 1213 BC. The high chronology dates for that are a little bit earlier, 1304 to 1237. Now, let me stop here. You have to know there are two systems of Egyptian chronology. One is called the high chronology, which dates things a little bit earlier, and the other one's called the low. So Hoffmeyer is saying, Wood's kind of cheating here. To get Amenhotep II as his pharaoh, he uses one system for one dynasty and he uses another system for another dynasty. That's cheating. Hoffmeyer writes, according to the now preferred lower chronology, the 1446 BC Exodus lands in the reign of Thutmose III, not Amenhotep II. Many evangelical scholars cling to the higher chronology because they have determined a priori that Amenhotep II has become their pharaoh of choice for the obstinate potentate that Moses dealt with. The second problem for Wood's Exodus pharaoh drowning in the sea, and this is, you got to pay attention, I think this is a good rebuttal by Hoffmeyer. But again, it's just a pharaoh candidate. The second problem for Wood's Exodus pharaoh drowning in the sea is that the mummy of Thutmose III was found in the Deir el-Bahri cache, while Amenhotep II's mummy was actually discovered in his tomb, one of only a few royal mummies discovered intact. So Amenhotep II was intact. In fact, all the mummies of the 15th century are accounted for. According to the X-rays and investigations of these mummies, none indicate a death by drowning. Following Wood's logic regarding Ramses II, remember Wood had said Ramses II drowned in the Red Sea. Following Wood's logic regarding Ramses II, one would have to conclude that none of the 18th dynasty pharaohs could have been the Pharaoh of the Exodus, because none of them drowned, according to their mummy pathology. Now, this point by Hoffmeyer, I think, is well taken. Drowning as a cause of death for Amenhotep II would be detectable by virtue of pathological inspection. Hoffmeyer would argue, like Petrovich, that it's not necessary to say the Pharaoh of the Exodus died anyway, so it's okay to posit Ramses II. He's just saying, look, none of these other guys drowned, but Hoffmeyer knows that there's going to be people like Petrovich that don't have him dying in the Red Sea. So I'm not going to press the point too far. I'm going to stick with my man Ramses II. But he uses this to sort of dig at Wood, and it's a good dig. It's a good rebuttal. But Hoffmeyer, again, he doesn't press it too far, but I don't want you to miss the point. So the real question, though, is what about the firstborn son? Now, this is interesting enough here. Ramses II was succeeded by Mer-en-Ptah, or Merneptah, if you prefer that. But Mer-en-Ptah was not his firstborn son. So Hoffmeyer is going to argue, look, I've got a good candidate here, Ramses II. I got the name in Exodus 111. He was not succeeded by his firstborn son. And I don't have to have him drowning in the Exodus, so we don't even need to worry about the pathology of the mummy. And he's going to say, who's the pharaoh for the early date? At the very least, you can't say he died, because we have all the mummies, and they've all been examined. So you're going to have to exclude that from your argument at the least. But in case of Ramses II, again, he was succeeded by Mer-en-Ptah, who was actually the 13th son of Ramses II. We know that from Egyptian texts. He was not Ramses II's firstborn. It's actually uncertain as to who Ramses II's firstborn was. I mean, he had like scores of kids, literally. And that brings us to wrap up, just as an Egyptological point of curiosity, KV5. You may not know any of this stuff about the pharaohs, but this is one of the reasons why it's a peripheral reason, I'll admit it, but it's one of the reasons why the discovery of KV5 was a big deal. This is back in the 90s, and I have a link to this on the episode webpage if you want to go back and read the New York Times article. KV5 was the tomb that was entirely underground. People have been walking over it for decades, and it's the largest tomb complex known for any in the entire spectrum of Egyptology. And this is the tomb where scores of Ramses II's sons were interred. It's discovered by Kent Weeks, who was an American Egyptologist. I don't know what's happening. It used to be you could actually go into each one. There was an interactive website called the Theban Mapping Project that appears to be defunct right now. I don't know if they moved it, called it something else, who knows. But you can at least go read the article. This thing is massive, and it has lots and lots of rooms. It's going to take decades to excavate because they're all filled in, and it's all underground. So it could be that we would find, again, if it's fully excavated, there may be the remains of Ramses II's firstborn son there. And then we'd find out who he was. And maybe something interesting from hieroglyphs that might be there, or something said about, who knows. But what we do know for certain is that Ramses II was not succeeded by his firstborn. That's the point of contact and the point of knowledge for our purposes. Again, that late daters are going to throw out there and say, look, we've got a good candidate here. Now, that's what we're going to cover for the date of the Exodus. Look, as we've gone through, I've given thumbs up to both sides at different points by virtue of this rebuttal's kind of lame. Okay, that means the other side is a good argument. So there are good arguments to be made on both sides. I've said that before in prior episodes, and now you kind of get a feel for why I said it and why I mean it. There are good arguments on both sides of this. For me, the most significant point I think has to be Exodus 1:11. If it's true that Ramses in Exodus 1:11 is Ramses II, then the debate is over. The late date is the winner. Defenses of Ramses in Exodus 1:11, against Redford's objections, I think those objections against Redford are workable. Again, early daters are going to cling to what Redford says, but I think they're workable. But that doesn't mean that he's right or the rebuttals are right. I mean, ultimately, who knows? But it looks like that is a really telling point. I mean, if you're not going to be a late dater, you've got to do something with Exodus 1:11. That's the linchpin right there. Now, as far as the editorial updating, because that's how the early date is going to defend itself against Ramses in Exodus 1:11 being Ramses II. I mentioned that I thought Wood's comeback to Hoffmeyer on the updating question about Zoan was lame. It is. But I think there's something else going on that neither article mentions here. Okay, let me just throw this out. I'm not sure that formulaic language for editorial updating is required to have an updating. See, that's Hoffmeyer's point. If you don't have the editorial language that, hey, we updated something here, that is, in other words, if you don't have that, it's not an updating. I don't know if that's really true. And I'll give you an example. Genesis 36:31. Now, this is Genesis, okay? It says this. Let's see here. We have a section. These are back in verse 15. These are the chiefs of the sons of Esau. And then you get these genealogies, a whole list of names. And then in verse 31, we read this. These are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the Israelites. Okay, that very obviously, and the names of the kings follow. Bela, Jobab, blah, 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 blah. The names don't matter for our discussion. The comment matters. Moses could not have written that because he's writing before Israel had a king. How would he know that these are the names of the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the Israelites? That's a retrospective statement. That is an editorial comment by a later writer. And did you notice? There's no formulaic language in there. Now, I'll grant, this is what Hoffmeyer would say if he was listening in here. He would say, well, hey, it wasn't about toponyms, it's about kings. Well, that's true. That's true. It's not about toponyms. But it is certainly updated information. And consequently, for me, I think the updating question is still open. I don't think the formulaic language requirement of Hoffmeyer closes it. Because of passages like this, and this isn't the only one. You have comments like this in Scripture where it's very evident that a later hand is updating his readers with information in some way, and it's not always the same way. So you could say, well, this is like a thesis topic. It's always the same way with toponym. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But is that a requirement? Is there a rule, some cosmic rule that says you cannot have any toponym updating without this language? I mean, who makes the cosmic rule? I don't know. So for me, the editorial thing is still on the table. It's still an open question, which is why I don't think that it's case closed for the late date on the basis of Exodus 1:11. I do think, Redford's arguments have been answered pretty well. They're workable. But again, I think there's, for me, this point about the editorial updating, there's still some uncertainty there for me as far as it being case closed. I just don't think that's the case. One last comment. Having said all that, I still think there are problems with Egyptian chronology. And this is where, David Rohl, and really not just Rohl, because again, Rohl gets a bad reputation, and in some cases I think he deserves it because he says wacky stuff, okay? But there are other parts of Rohl's work that I find really interesting, and I would use the word compelling in a couple instances. Like yes, we definitely have a problem here that needs to be fixed. It's not just Rohl. It's something called the Ancient Chronology Forum. If you think this is just one renegade Egyptologist guy named David Rohl, you're wrong. There are scholars from all sorts of disciplines: astronomy, Mediterranean archaeology, Syro-Palestinian archaeology, Egyptology. Okay, they were part of this group called the Ancient Chronology Forum. They published, a journal. I don't know how many years it was. I mean, it's defunct now, but most of it's online. There are a lot of holes in this. And a number of these holes, a number of these problems do affect the way Egyptian history and biblical history align. That's just the reality. I don't know who's right, the quote unquote traditionalist, chronology people, or some of the Ancient Chronology Forum, the chronological revision people. I don't know who's right. And frankly, neither do any of them. But they're making a case, for changing the chronology of these areas in the ancient world, which affects the Bible and affects topics like this. They make cases. And some of the cases really, I think, deserve attention. Some of them, Rohl says nutty stuff. Good, so what? What about the stuff that he says that isn't nutty? You're using his nutty stuff to excuse yourself from looking at it. That's just not good methodology. So I think there are still problems with the whole system that need resolution. Maybe they can't be resolved. I don't know. So it's because of this kind of stuff that I find this stuff interesting. But you hit a wall with chronology where you just say, for lack of a better way of putting it, a lot of this stuff is insoluble. And for me, I just wasn't going to spend any more time on it. I would rather do biblical theology in its ancient Near Eastern context. I think it's more interesting. I think it's powerful. I think it affects lives. I think it helps people become better readers of Scripture 100 times over more than a question like the date of the Exodus. I don't want to denigrate anybody's work here because I benefit from their work. I think this whole episode is an illustration of how we benefit from people who do drill down. But I'm actually saying they need to drill down more because there are people who have produced serious problems that need to be addressed. And for me, I'm not going to be a chronologist. That's not my calling. It's not my career. I'm going to go off and do what I do, like on the podcast and the stuff that I write in Unseen Realm, biblical theology in light of its own ancient Near Eastern context. It's ancient context, period. Israelite, first century Jew. That's what I do. That's what I know I'm called to do, to spend the hours that I have on, not this. So I've tried to tell you why, and at least give you an idea that, yep, there are good arguments on both sides. So you get Exodus 12 in the Passover, and then you hit chapter 13, and you get these first two verses. I'm going to read them. The Lord said unto Moses, consecrate to me all the firstborn. Whatever is the first to open the womb among the people of Israel, both man and of beast, is mine. So there's a connection here because there's a reference to the firstborn, and of course Passover comes on the heels or in connection with the last plague, which is the death of the firstborn. And the Passover was that protection offering. If you're not familiar with that term for pasak, the verb for that's behind the noun Pesach, Passover, you can go listen to the old episode a couple episodes ago. But the sacrifice of the Passover lamb was about protecting the ones who did it and then put the blood on the doorpost and the lintel of their homes. So there's a connection between the idea of the firstborn either dying or, and this is important for this episode, or being protected, and chapter 13, this consecration of the firstborn. Now you hit those first two verses, consecrate to me the firstborn, whatever's first open the womb is mine, of man and beast. And then you get this, what feels like an intrusion in verses 3 through 10. It's the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Listeners might recall a few episodes ago I mentioned that these feasts get connected in the Hebrew Bible. Apparently there was some sort of difference between them or separation, or there's a development of thought here, or at least probably a better way to put it, a development of portrayal. But it's not really an intrusion because if you're going to connect the Feast of Unleavened Bread with the Passover, then it's not too interruptive to start talking about the Feast of Unleavened Bread here in connection with the consecration of the firstborn, because the context for that is the Passover. But I mentioned that to say, I'm hoping you're getting a feel for how, when you read through not just Exodus, but different portions of the Bible, it just seems like the writers will at times skip from one thing to the next. And in some cases, you got to really pay attention to discern any connection between the sections. And sometimes you do have true intrusions, and there could be literary reasons for that. But this is one of these instances where it feels like an intrusion, but okay, there is a way to connect these things. And then you hit verse 11. So let me read verses 11 through 16. And this isn't going to take us to the end of the chapter, because after verse 16, then you get the pillar of cloud and fire. Now that feels much more intrusive because we're not even into the Exodus itinerary yet. But up until this point, again, you can see the conceptual connection. So here's verses 11 through 16. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your fathers, and shall give it to you, you shall set apart to the Lord all that first opens the womb. So this is hearkening back to verses 1 and 2 about consecrating the firstborn. Continuing in Exodus 13, verse 12. So set apart to the Lord all that first opens the womb. All the firstborn of your animals that are males shall be the Lord's. Every firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb. We're going to come back to that a couple times. Or if you will not redeem it, you shall break its neck. Every firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. And when in time to come your son asks you, what does this mean? You shall say to him, by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. For when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of animals. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all the males that first open the womb, but all the firstborn of my sons I redeem. It shall be as a mark on your head or frontlets between your eyes, for by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt. So that's verses 11 to 16. You say, well, what's the big deal, with this firstborn stuff, connected to the Passover? Well, there's actually a fairly active controversy here. There are certain scholars that argue that the passage, specifically Exodus 13, the first two verses, and then verses 11 through 16, that these verses are to be taken literally, that Yahweh demanded the Israelites to sacrifice their firstborn male child. In other words, human sacrifice. And they further argue, certain scholars, that this happened in Israel, and it was part of orthodox, normative worship of Yahweh. In other words, it wasn't an abomination or an aberration back in the days of Moses and Joshua, the early days of Israel. Now, in particular, this thing has gone back and forth, this controversy. And in 2004, there was a book that came out. Now, this book has not been reviewed much in scholarly circles, but the author, for whatever reason, the author has sort of been one of these scholars that kind of gets into the public eye, through what I pejoratively refer to as archaeoporn, because of the sort of sensational or salacious aspects of this topic. People will find her, and then this particular scholar, and then it's big news about how the Old Testament advocates human sacrifice or something like that. Archaeoporn. So the scholar's name is Francesca Stavrokopoulou, and her book is entitled King Manasseh and Child Sacrifice, subtitle Biblical Distortions of Historical Realities. It's a 2004 book. It's a scholarly publication. I think de Gruyter is the publisher. So her work in 2004, sort of is the latest iteration, or at least in the public eye, the latest iteration of this whole controversy. Does Exodus 13 teach that Yahweh wanted the Israelites to offer their firstborn children as some sort of commemoration of what happened at Passover? Now, as you hear me say that, the red light should go off on your head. That how in the world does that make any sense? And I'd agree. You might ask, well, how can anyone argue this point? Given what we just read in verses 11 through 16, it's clear that there's provision here to not, offer the child as a sacrifice. Okay, in verse 13, every firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. In other words, you can substitute, something else for it. You don't have to. The point is not that you have to kill your firstborn child, but you go through this ritual act, as some sort of commemorative thing, just to remind you of the firstborn and the cost of the Passover and all this kind of stuff. So there's a provision there to not kill the children. And it even says, when your son asks you, hey, why are we doing this? Well, you tell him the story of the Passover, and this is why, we sacrifice the animals, but we don't sacrifice the children, because the Lord redeemed us. The Lord took us out of Egypt, the realm of death, as it were, And as a substitute, we had a lamb back at Passover, and then of course Israelites would be observing the Passover. But since it was the firstborn, this is another part of the ritual remembrance of what happened at Passover. So you would think, well, it's clear that they're not doing this. They're not sacrificing their children. And it's clear from verses 11 through 16 that they don't have to. So why would anybody argue this? And not only that, but it makes little sense to commemorate the deliverance of your firstborn child by Yahweh's protection. Again, the Pesach to protect, the Pesach sacrifice of the lamb. You need the whole idea of Passover was to commemorate deliverance. Why would you commemorate deliverance of your firstborn child by killing it? It just makes zero sense. It's just kind of a bizarre thought pattern. Let's kill what Yahweh spared because he wants us to kill it now. Again, it just doesn't make any sense. So you'd ask, well, why would anybody think this? And I'm going to go through the logic and the argumentation of why this sort of thing is argued. And you're going to see some patterns here. And I'm going to sort of overview it for this next part of the episode. Then I want to sort of drill down a little bit on Stavrokopoulos's work, because again, she's the one that has sort of been in the public eye in this regard, at least for this topic in recent memory. So the logic and argumentation for this is as follows. This is how certain scholars, not by no means the majority, it's a small number, but they do it. And again, by virtue of the nature of the topic, it does get attention from time to time, sort of out in the populace. So the first argument would be, well, verses 11 through 16 of Exodus 13 were added later. They weren't there originally, they were just added later. A later time when Israelite religion had moved beyond child sacrifice, it has some moment of enlightenment. Hey, we shouldn't be killing our kids, And so then some scribe comes along and says, well, there's that stuff in the Torah, those first two verses of Exodus 13, and so I'll fix that. I'll add some verses and then we'll be okay. And you say that's kind of artificial and self-serving. I would agree. But this is how the argument is made, and it's how it's been made for quite a long time now. This goes back to Otto Eisfeld, who's famous for as a source critic, the JDP stuff, and other things too. He was a Old Testament scholar of some time ago. Eisfeld's views are sort of representative. Now, there's an article by Hatting, Hattingh, and Meyer, Meyer, that provide a short literature review of this issue. And they start with Eisfeld because everybody does. Their article is entitled "Devoted to Destruction: A Case of Human Sacrifice in Leviticus 27?" So they're actually talking about a different passage, Leviticus 27. But in so doing, they are going to overview the history of this question. And I think their article is pretty useful for that. So I'm going to quote, I'll quote a portion here, and I'll pick up a few other things with their article. But again, it's a pretty useful overview. They write, Eisfeld, in 1935, also provides a broad overview of how he thinks the ideas around child sacrifice developed. In essence, it was portrayed in a positive light before the Deuteronomic reform. Let me just stop there. The Deuteronomic reform, when you see that in biblical scholarship, that is a reference to the time of King Josiah of Judah, roughly 640 to 609 BC. It was during Josiah's reign that he started getting rid of idolatry in a big way, and he made a concerted effort, to get rid of certain practices. And it was also, that's also the time when the book of the law was discovered. Now, classic critical scholarship says the book of the law that was quote unquote discovered was Deuteronomy, and people are kind of across the confessional board, across the scholarly board, spectrum they're fine with saying it's Deuteronomy, but a lot, I would say in this case, it is fair to say most critical biblical scholars would say that Deuteronomy wasn't discovered, it was written during this time. This is its point of origin. And they would use this sort of assumption to, say that basically they're going to argue that the entire thing was written at this time or later, as opposed to someone like a supplementarian, who would say, well, some of it might have been early, Mosaic, and then it gets added to later, that kind of thing. But they're going to argue this because there are certain changes in laws in Deuteronomy from Exodus. And it is helpful in certain cases to explain the differences against the backdrop of the horrors of idolatry. So because, again, that's a good approach in certain passages, it's very common that people will presume that the discovery by Hilkiah the priest of Deuteronomy is not a discovery at all. It's sort of biblical code for the priests writing it at this time. So again, Deuteronomic reform, let's go back to Eisfeld. He says, before we had this Deuteronomic thing happen, before the time of Josiah, child sacrifice was viewed positively. But things changed after this reform, and later authors did everything in their power to put more distance between this embarrassing act and the cult of Yahweh, the worship of Yahweh, and projected it onto Canaanite religion. So the whole notion, and you'll see this in the books of Kings and in the prophets, essentially linking this practice to foreign cults, Canaanite cults. There are a number of scholars, Eisfeld among them, would say, this wasn't the problem of the foreign pagans. This was an Israelite problem. And so when they start addressing it in the evolution of their religion, they just start blaming the Canaanites. So this is, again, I think, the major trajectory of how this is argued, this notion that the original worship of Yahweh at one time had human sacrifice. And again, if you object to verses 11 through 16, they're just going to say, oh, those were added later. And you say, well, that's just an assumption. And you would be correct. There's no empirical data to prove that verses 11 through 16 were added later. I'm just telling you this is how it's argued. Well, that stuff's later. Because look at the assumption here, that Israelite religion, like lots of other religions, sort of in an anthropological approach, that it evolves, it becomes more enlightened. Okay, so that's the underlying assumption here. And so when you have passages like verses 11 through 16 that soften or do away with or object to Like, no, it's not. You don't really literally offer your firstborn. They'll say, well, that's later, after Israelite religion had evolved to a certain point. So there's an evolutionary assumption that goes hand in hand with this. Secondly, they'll argue that commands in the Old Testament elsewhere, outside of Exodus 13 here, from the same presumed time period of the alleged later edition of verses 11 through 16, rail against child sacrifice. And they would say, well, that means it was happening. You wouldn't have the prophets rail against it unless it was happening. Well, that's pretty logical. I would say, yes, if it was a problem and the prophets rail against it, I mean, they wouldn't be railing against something that didn't happen. So I get that. But now here's the added thought. That means it was happening. And so therefore, that also means it was legitimate at one time. Again, that, folks, is what we call a non sequitur, a conclusion that does not necessarily follow. But again, my point here is this is how the idea is argued. So you get those two ideas. And again, I'm hoping you see that there are some logical leaps here. It's pure speculation that verses 11 through 16 are later than verses 1 and 2. Even in standard JEDP studies, about the authorship of the Torah, they don't, you can find plenty of them that do not divide up the text that way, that attribute verses 11 through 16 wholesale as some later source. So I don't know if I want to call it idiosyncratic. I will. It's a bit idiosyncratic, but it makes sense, quote unquote, to critical scholars because they presuppose the evolutionary development of Israelite religion from something primitive to something more enlightened. But again, it's pure speculation that one set of verses was added after the first two. Secondly, there's a logical leap here because verse 13 allows for the redemption of a firstborn donkey. Let me read it to you. Every firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb. Or if you will not redeem it, then break its neck. Then do away with it or sacrifice it or whatever. So by using this logic, the critical logic, did that mean that the prophets had some problem with sacrificing firstborn donkeys so that when the guy added verses 11 through 16, he was also offended by letting donkeys off the hook? Or he wanted donkeys off the hook. And so he put the firstborn donkey line in there as also evidence that they had evolved in their thinking. Like, what? I mean, how does that make any sense? Durham, in his Exodus commentary, the Word Biblical Commentary, says here, the animal, again, the firstborn donkey, could be ransomed or replaced, the Hebrew is padah, by a flock animal, or it could be destroyed. In other words, and he has in parentheses, not sacrificed, but just destroyed. Because he takes note that the breaking of the neck isn't a sacrificial act here. The firstborn human male was to be replaced, but at what cost, the text doesn't say. It just says you redeem it. And he says, neither does Exodus 34:20. Let me read you that verse. The firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb, or you will not redeem it. Or if you will not redeem it, you shall break its neck. All the firstborn of your sons you shall redeem, and none shall appear before me empty-handed. So it actually occurs in another place in Exodus. But again, the logic, if you say somebody's adding these verses because they're more enlightened, and they add them because the practice of child sacrifice was so offensive by now, they had evolved to the point where they're offended by this now. Well, then I guess they had evolved to the point where redeeming firstborn donkeys is necessary too, that somehow that offended them as well, which you'll typically see. And again, it's interesting. Even in the dissertation I'll quote later, which evaluates Stavropoulos' work in one section of it, even that person misses this detail, the firstborn donkey. I mean, again, the logic just doesn't work, but it's just this one line in verse 13 that often gets missed, but it mars the logic of how this idea is put forth. Another thing I could say is some would argue in response that the passage lets the matter up to parents. Now, Stavropoulos actually does argue this. In other words, she and others would say, well, look, people who had verses 11 through 16, whenever that was added later, okay, they could still sacrifice their kid if they wanted to. But if they didn't, well, then they could redeem it. So it doesn't totally do away, with the child sacrifice. It just gives them the option. They could, if they chose, offer their firstborn male child to Yahweh, or they could redeem it. Now, here's a good question. Let me suggest this question. Do we ever see this happening in the Hebrew Bible? And the answer would be no, we don't. So this actually amounts to an argument from silence or even an argument from circular reasoning. I'll try to explain it just briefly here. So we're told that verses 11 through 16 were added later during some zealous monotheistic spasm, like the religious reforms, during the time of Josiah. Okay, and this also coincides with the time of some of Israel's prophets. Okay, the era of the Deuteronomic legislation, or the Deuteronomistic period. We're further told that the various passages in the prophets that condemn child sacrifice come from the same sources and period, the prophets at the same time period. So consequently, so the conclusion goes, the prophets were trying to eradicate this practice, a practice that was legitimized by Exodus 13, 1 through 2. The solution was preaching against it and adding to the Torah, adding verses 11 through 16. That sounds like a neat picture, but there's one essential item missing. There isn't a single passage that endorses child sacrifice in the Hebrew Bible. There's your argument from silence. They assume that the practice was endorsed by Exodus 13, 1 through 2, but to make Exodus 13, 1 through 2 an endorsement, you have to eliminate verses 11 through 16 to a later period. That's also circular reasoning. You might say, well, hey, Exodus 13, 1 through 2 is an endorsement there. Well, in logic, that's called assuming what you need to prove. It goes something like this. I'm going to pretend I'm a promoter of this idea now. My argument that Exodus 13, 1 through 2 calls for child sacrifice is legitimate because verses 11 through 16 were added. And we know that they were added because Exodus 13, 1 and 2 affirms the practice. See that neat circle I just argued? That's circular reasoning. Okay, you can't use your assumption as proof to argue in favor of your assumption. You don't use an assumption as proof of your assumption. And all you have is the assumption. You need some other passage that illustrates the practice of child sacrifice, that it was occurring and that Yahweh was pleased with it. If you find that, then your take on Exodus 13, 1 through 2 becomes coherent. And then, in turn, your idea about the lateness of verses 11 through 16 would also become coherent. But as it stands, you have circular reasoning. Now, the approach also assumes, we're talking about logical jumps here. The approach also assumes that if a practice existed, it must have been approved, especially if it was condemned by the prophets. That, folks, in logic is, again, what we call a non sequitur. And it's sort of akin to the Yahweh's wife thinking. I don't know if I want to get into that or not, but you could say it like this. Of course, child sacrifice occurred in Israel. The prophets are condemning it. It's happening. It's going on. But why would the fact that it happens mean that it was legitimate early in Israel's history? Why? Now, I think it's worth pointing out that my skepticism here and rejection of the idea that Exodus 13:1 and 2 is within the scholarly mainstream. This isn't just me. This is not something tied to evangelicalism or some other confessional commitment. For instance, I'm going to quote Mark Smith here. Mark's essay, Child Sacrifice as the Extreme Case and Calculation. And it comes from the book entitled Not Sparing the Child, subtitle Human Sacrifice in the Ancient World and Beyond, Studies in Honor of Professor Paul G. Mosca. Mosca's done a lot of work in this area. He did a lot of work on Molech. I'm going to quote from Smith here. And Smith is not an evangelical. He's a Catholic, but he's not an evangelical. And he's about as mainstream in biblical scholarship as you can get. Smith writes this: the references to child sacrifice in, for example, 2 Kings 16:3 and 21:6 likewise represent extremity. In these cases, the outer limits of idolatry. Both verses are intriguing for their brevity and perspective. 2 Kings 16:3 attributes to Ahaz the sacrifice of his son, in a clause opening with Hebrew vegam, and also. Elsewhere in the narrative sections of 2 Kings, this construction marks material layered into accounts, either to express condemnation, for example, 2 Kings 13:6, 21:16, or to note action taken against condemnable practices, 2 Kings 23:15 and verse 19 and verse 24. The report in 2 Kings 16:3 then offers a comparison, quote, like the abomination of the nations. That's what it compares child sacrifice to. I'll just read the verse. He walked in the way of the kings of Israel. He even burned his son as an offering, according to the despicable practices of the nations, whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. So back to Smith. Smith saying, well, we have this comparison here. Here the practice is marked as the outer limits of immoral behavior, being associated with other nations by the implied narrator. In this way, this traditional practice is represented as the extreme measure of Ahaz's idolatrous behavior. The context for the practice is not supplied, although 2 Kings 16:5 refers to the siege of Jerusalem. Quote, they besieged Ahaz and they were unable in battling, unquote. It would be tempting, Smith says, to connect the report of a child sacrifice with the siege, but this oversteps the evidence. More to the point, the report of the practice charges King Ahaz with the worst behaviors associated by this narrative with foreign nations. This is historiography as sermon. The similar formulation for child sacrifice in 2 Kings 21:6 belongs to a long catalog of Manasseh's sins, where in 2 Kings 16:3, child sacrifice heads the characterization of Ahaz's sin. In Manasseh's case, 2 Kings 21:6, it is one item in a longer laundry list of idolatrous acts. And then Smith concludes, in 2 Kings 16:3 and 21:6, child sacrifice is represented as a foreign practice wholly unbefitting of Israel's kings. These passages represent the practice as the extreme case of immoral non-Israelite behavior. End of the section. So, again, this is where most scholars are at. They're going to say, look, it happened. It's idolatrous. They will trace it to, again, things outside Israel that are brought in terms of apostate religion on the part of certain kings. This is where the mainstream is still at. But again, you get scholars sort of, on the periphery here, or at least, their views on this are, more minority. And again, we're talking about how in the world they argue this. Condemnations are later than Exodus 13:1 through 2, which is our launching point for this episode. They'll argue, again, I think pretty demonstrably in a circle, to do this. They'll assume that practice certainly was accepted, especially when it was condemned by the prophets. And the prophets are later. Well, why would they think that way? Because they have this evolutionary mindset. Israelite religion evolved from something primitive and icky to something enlightened. Okay? So this is, again, how the idea is articulated. Now, you might guess there are bigger issues behind all of this. It's tied to the controversy or difficulty of the nature of the MLK sacrifice, which is variously, you have to remember Hebrew and Semitic languages, they didn't have vowels. Okay, so you're dealing with consonants here. So MLK in Hebrew and broader Semitic languages can mean a few things. It could be the word for king. It could be the consonants that form the name of a deity like Molech. It could be the reference to a sacrifice, a molk sacrifice. So there's a problem with knowing in any given text which one of those things is in mind or an admixture of some. And so that the controversy over this extends into this area. And I'm going to try to unpack this for you. So that, when these sorts of things, these MLK events, okay, molk sacrifices or whatever, these MLK consonants, okay, I'll say events, these MLK events, when you see them happen in the Hebrew Bible, the difficulty is, are we talking about a deity or are we talking about a sacrifice or something else, or again, some mix between the two? So the terminology, what that means is that the terminology may not refer to a deity. It may not refer to Molech. Some of these passages may not be talking about Molech. And it may not even be talking about a sacrifice, a child sacrifice from Molech religion. It could be talking about some other kind of sacrifice. So this is where the battleground really gets to. How do we understand these MLK events or sacrifices? So I'm going to read from Hatting and Meyer's literature review again. This is a more extensive portion because they go through this issue. So you'll get a broad overview here of the problems and of the issues that are part of this discussion. They write, any discussion on human sacrifice in the Hebrew Bible at some point touches on Molech. Over 80 years ago, Otto Eisfeld, in 1935, discussed Molech and child sacrifice. He started his argument by examining the phenomenon in the Phoenician Punic sphere. but also provided an overview of how he thinks child sacrifice developed in ancient Israel. Eisfeld argued that in Punic, Molech, actually M-O-L-K, is how it would be vocalized, was a sacrificial term and not the name of a deity. For Eisfeld, Molch was initially also a sacrificial term in ancient Israel, similar to the one in Punic texts, which was eventually changed to the name of a deity. Eisfeld believes that the motives behind this change could be found in the Deuteronomic reform of Josiah, and he understands later texts as an attempt to distantiate the sacrifice of children from the Yahweh cult by changing the meaning of the term to the name of a god, foreign god. Let me stop there. So what Eisfeld argues is that, look, hey, we got this term here in Phoenician, this MLK event, and we got some of these happen in the Hebrew Bible. And, in Phoenician stuff, it has to do with Molech. But Eisfeld thought, yeah, you know what? I'll bet, or I think, that in ancient Israel, they were essentially doing the same sacrifice, because the same term is used, the same sacrifice, and it was legit. It was okay. You could kill your kid. But then in the Deuteronomic reform, when Israel reached this new level of enlightenment, the priest, whoever's, fiddling with the text, or again, writing Deuteronomy at this point, or whatever they're writing, whatever they're adding or writing, they decided to point to the text in a certain way so that you would think that this is a foreign sacrifice, something associated with Molech, the deity. And that way they basically covered their butts. They distracted attention away from the idea that this used to be part of ancient Israel's worship, child sacrifice. And so that their readers would think, oh, this is the bad guy Molech. That's where this comes from. Okay, that is the hermeneutic of suspicion in full display for you, right there. There's no empirical evidence that will point to what I just sketched out. That is taking the data and assembling the data in such a way, in other words, you're interpreting the data. It's your interpretation of the data, but there's nothing about the data themselves that compel that reconstruction. But that was Eisfeld's reconstruction. And again, I do think it's a good illustration of the hermeneutic of suspicion. Something's condemned in the Hebrew Bible, that must mean it was okay before. Again, logic, please. Can we have rules of logic that everyone sort of understands and operates by? Can we do that? Okay, back to the Hatting and Meyer overview. They write, before Eisfeld, the interpreters of Punic inscriptions had read the MLK references either as the name of a deity or as a title, king, capital K. In either case, referring to the divine recipient of the offering commemorated by the inscription. That was Heider's view. In 1972, 37 years after Eisfeld, Moshe Weinfeld engaged with Eisfeld's material and reached different conclusions with regard to most of Eisfeld's arguments on Molech. Where Eisfeld thought that child sacrifice happened in ancient Israel, Weinfeld argued that, quote, making to pass through the fire, unquote, meant passing through or between rows of flames as a means of purification and dedication. Thus, Weinfeld thought that the burning of children should not be taken literally, but rather figuratively, as it denotes dedication to the idolatrous priesthood. At the beginning of Weinfeld's article, he makes an important, quote-unquote, methodological comment, which we, Hatting and Meyer here, which we think is important to keep in mind. And then they quote Weinfeld, who said, in discussion on human sacrifices, a distinction has to be made between a sacrifice which, proceeding from an extraordinary situation, a crisis, calamity, and so on, occurs only rarely and at infrequent intervals, and by contrast, a human sacrifice as a fixed institution. That's the end of Weinfeld's quote in the Hatting and Meyer article. So basically they're pointing out that Weinfeld said, hey, look, there's a difference here between this happening in some sort of reactionary panic kind of thing, some crisis, and it being a normal institution. Those are two different things. Back to their article. They write, this seems to imply that Weinfeld does not question the fact that under extraordinary circumstances, adults or children might have been sacrificed to Yahweh. It also implies that Weinfeld actually saw some link between sacrifice and, it's a Hebrew term, sarech, a debate which we will engage with later. Okay? We're not doing Leviticus 27, so we're not going to worry about that. They continue, yet he, Weinfeld, takes serious exception to the idea that human sacrifice might have been a fixed institution in ancient Israel. Weinfeld just didn't believe that. In the 1980s, they continue, two scholars revisited the issue of Molech and consequently human sacrifice. First, George Heider, 1985, produced a study on Molech, concluding that Molech was the name of a god and not a sacrificial term, as suggested by Eisfeld. Yet Heider agrees with Eisfeld that the cult, quote, was licit, in other words, it was allowed, in Israel until Josiah's reform, unquote, and that it actually involved sacrificing children. Heider also disagrees with Eisfeld in arguing that the cult of Molech is probably Canaanite and not Israelite, or could even be regarded as Phoenician, but was not part of the Yahweh cult. Later, John Day, 1989, concluded that child sacrifice did occur in the Canaanite world, and he sees no reason to doubt the Hebrew Bible's allusion to human sacrifice as actual physical sacrifices. Day agrees with Heider that child sacrifice as presented in the Hebrew Bible was practiced in ancient Israel. Like Heider, Day also thinks that Molech possibly refers to a Canaanite god and disagrees strongly with Eisfeld in this regard. More recently, Francesca Stavrokopoulou has been the most vocal on the issue of child sacrifice. Stavrokopoulou, 2004, agrees with Heider and Day that child sacrifice was practiced in ancient Israel, but she also agrees with Eisfeld that originally the term Molech was probably a sacrificial term, the MLK term. Stavrokopoulou actually argues that there was possibly three different kinds of child sacrifice, namely a firstborn sacrifice, the MLK sacrifice, and the sacrifice to the Shaddai gods. Now I'm going to break in here. The Shaddai gods is a reference to the Deir Allah text. It's a text that's famous for its connection with the Balaam account. We're not going to be drilling down there, but it has the term Shaddaian in that text. It's Aramaic. And that is a cognate to Shadim, which is the term for territorial deity in Deuteronomy 32:17. So the reason I bring it up is if you take Deuteronomy 32:17, the Shadim there as the Shaddaian, well, Deuteronomy 32 presents the sacrifices there as an aberration. In other words, this was not allowed. This was not a positive, licit institution in Israel. Again, if you take Deuteronomy 32 there. But again, people say, oh, it's so much later, blah, 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 so on and so forth. despite the fact that Deuteronomy 32, if you look at the study by Paul Sanders, which is the most thorough to date, there's a good bit of that is demonstrably linguistically earlier. Let's just put it this way, earlier than you would think the enlightened Deuteronomic reform would be. But anyway, this is getting too far afield. But I just wanted you to note that there's a connection here between the gods of the nations, the sacrifices to them, and this whole issue. Now, most of these cults, this is back to Hatting and Meyer, most of these cults, talking about Stavrokopoulos's view, she says, were initially associated with Yahweh worship, an argument which has a lot in common with Eisfeldt's original study, and hence in this regard she differs from Heiser and Day. And then they quote Stavrakopoulos, just a little bit, I'll read it to you. This discussion has argued that the biblical portrayal of child sacrifice as a foreign practice is historically unreliable. So she just says the biblical data are just unreliable here, the way they're presented. It has been suggested that child sacrifice is instead better understood as a native and normative element of Judahite religious practice, including Yahweh worship, unquote. So that's just a little portion from Stavrokopoulou. Now back to Hatting and Meyer. This quote is from a chapter by Stavrokopoulou on the, quote, distortion of child sacrifice, in which she argues that although it was initially part of Yahweh worship, most biblical texts portray it as a foreign practice. She just disagrees that that's legit. She thinks that's propaganda on the part of the biblical writers. Now, in regard to that, well, that'll be the end of my quotation of Hatting and Meyer. But in regard to their study, their article was about Leviticus 27, 28, and 29. I'll just read you the two verses because you might be curious here. But no devoted thing that a man devotes to the Lord, of anything that he has, whether man or beast, or of his inherited field, shall be sold or redeemed. Every devoted thing is most holy to the Lord. No one devoted who is to be devoted for destruction from mankind shall be ransomed. He shall surely be put to death. So devoted to the Lord is the word haram. This is the verb of destruction for the conquest. And so that last line is sort of the issue. People who are supposed to be devoted to destruction shall be ransomed. In other words, you can't redeem them. They have to be put to death. That's Leviticus 27, 28, and 29. That's the comment. So their article was about that passage, but there's no way to prove, as they admit in the article, that what's referred to in Leviticus 27, 28, and 29, there's no way to prove that passage was about a sacrifice, like a ritual event, as opposed to like a death penalty requirement. One can see these verses as applying to Exodus 22:20, for example. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction. Like there's actually a law in the Torah that if somebody, if you see somebody, offering to some other god, then that's a death penalty offense. So Leviticus 27, 28, and 29, could be referring to that kind of situation. There's no way to know or to prove that it's like a religious ritual. Like in terms of an institution in ancient Israel, it could very well just be, you committed a capital offense, you have to die now, and there's no possibility of your redemption. This is a death penalty offense, sacrificing to some other god. So, in theory, you can have a member of your household, maybe your wife or a servant or something, somebody in your extended family, you catch them offering a sacrifice to another god, that's a death penalty offense. So that could very well be what Leviticus 27 is talking about. And the authors recognize that. It's conceivable, again, that maybe it also applies, not just somebody in your household doing this, committing the offense of Exodus 22:20. But we know from the book of Judges, for instance, that instead of driving all of the people out, okay, and again, my position is that the rationale for this, was the targeting of the giant clans here. Nevertheless, you're going to have people in these places that get caught up in this and they die in the conquest. And we learn from the book of Judges that there was intermarriage going on with these people. They didn't drive them all out. I mean, they don't necessarily have to kill them. Again, as I talked about in Unseen Realm, there are other verbs besides destruction verbs in the conquest narrative, but you certainly weren't supposed to intermarry with them. And so it's also conceivable that Exodus 22:20, that might be derivative of this problem. Later on they intermarry and one of these people sacrifices to a foreign god. There you go. It's a death penalty offense. There's any number of ways where you could come up with a scenario that sort of lurks behind Leviticus 27 and of course Exodus 22. But Stavrokopoulou isn't thinking along those trajectories. She's thinking along different trajectories. It's clear, again, she's operating from something of a hermeneutic of suspicion. She wants to, for some reason, exonerate Manasseh and simply asserts that the biblical writers are engaging in propaganda to cover up the fact that child sacrifice was once part of Yahweh worship. Now, Hatting and Meyer's literature review, as good as it is, and I think let me go back up and let me just flip over and just find the date of that. I know I just gave it to you, but I want to find the reference here. That was 2016. Okay, their article is 2016. As good as their literature review is, it does not include a recent dissertation. This is a Johns Hopkins University dissertation. But that isn't unusual. Published articles usually cover published literature, so whether they were aware of this dissertation or not, I don't know. But the dissertation was by Heath Durrell. It's Dewrell, and it's entitled Child Sacrifice in Ancient Israel and Its Opponents. It's Johns Hopkins PhD dissertation from 2012. Now, it has since been published by Eisenbronze, so you can actually buy this. It's a hardback book. If you have access to the dissertation databases, you might as well just get it there for free. But anyway, it has been published. Now, Durrell's thoughts, I've gone through this dissertation in regard to this topic, obviously. And I'm just going to read a few things that he has, a few comments that he has, because this is to date the most recent work on this issue. And again, this is Johns Hopkins. It's a PhD dissertation. This isn't a hack job. This is real scholarship. Not that the other ones aren't, but this is real scholarship too. So page 59 and following, just a few little portions of Durrell's dissertation. He writes, after a hiatus in monographs being devoted to the topic, Francesca Stavrakopoulou's King Manasseh and Child Sacrifice, Biblical Distortions of Historical Realities, devotes a significant portion of its attention to the MLK ritual. As the book's subtitle suggests, Stavrokopoulou is particularly concerned with the way in which the theological and ideological tendencies of the biblical writers has obscured the historical events and persons portrayed in their accounts. In the first half of her study, she focuses on the relationship between the biblical Manasseh and the historical Manasseh. concluding that the, quote, the portrayal of Manasseh within the text reveals not a portrait but a caricature, unquote. That's Stavrokopoulous' assessment. Significant for the purpose of this study, Durrell writes, is when Stavrokopoulou turns her critical lens to child sacrifice rituals, attempting to determine how accurately the biblical depiction of these rites matches historical reality. She begins by rejecting the suggestion of Weinfeld and others that the relevant texts actually refer to dedicatory rites. She points out that Ezekiel and Jeremiah, among others, explicitly state that children were killed as part of the ritual, which rules out understanding the ritual as involving anything other than sacrifice. While some of the terminology used in connection with child sacrifice might be ambiguous as to the nature of the rite, others, and he's listing a few Hebrew verbs here, others are clearly incompatible with Weinfeld's dedicatory hypothesis. So let me intrude here. I think this is a correct assessment. I think Stavrokopoulou is right on this point. You can't really just go with Weinfeld saying it's a baby dedication, okay? Where they're just sort of waving the kid through flames or walking through flame. She's right here. I mean, there are certain passages where it's very clear that the infant was killed. So I think she makes a good point there. Stavrokopoulou then, this is back to Durrell's dissertation, Stavrokopoulou then examines the way in which the ritual is depicted in the Hebrew Bible. The first thing that she notes is that the rite is often described as foreign to Israel. Deuteronomy 12, 29 through 31, for example, accuses the nations, whom Yahweh had driven out of the land, of sacrificing their sons and daughters. She notes, quote, the practice of child sacrifice is thus condemned, not because it is ethically untenable, but because it is foreign, unquote. Let me just stop there. That's really gratuitous on her part. That assumes that the only reason an Israelite would not want to do something is because some other nation's doing it. Like there's no other moral basis for not doing a practice than that one question. Do the nations do it? That's really gratuitous. But again, I think that reflects, I think it's not only a false dichotomy, but I think it sort of reflects her orientation, in terms of her attitude toward the biblical material. In essence, the Hebrew Bible, this is back to Durrell, in essence, the Hebrew Bible depicts the practice of child sacrifice as restricted to foreigners, like Mesha and the Sepharvites, the Judahites, who rejected Yahweh and chose to serve foreign deities like Ahaz and Manasseh. This is not a depiction that Stavrokopoulou is willing to take at face value, obviously. Durrell continues, she begins by exploring the implications of the law of the firstborn. Again, this is where we started our episode, Exodus 13. A discussion of the conclusions that she draws will appear below, but it is worth noting here that she views it as evidence that child sacrifice at one time played a prominent role in the Yahwistic cult. With regard to the nature of biblical MLK, Stavrokopoulou sides with Eisfeld in viewing the word as a sacrificial term rather than as a divine name or epithet, addressing the most cogent objection to Eisfeld's thesis, which is Leviticus 25, which refers to, quote, whoring after the MLK, a phrase that otherwise always refers to a supernatural being or an image, an idol associated with such a being, and never to a type of sacrifice. Stavrokopoulou recognizes this difficulty for her thesis and presents several solutions to it. Now, again, at this point, Durrell in his dissertation, he goes through the options, and the question is, well, are any of her comebacks at all satisfactory here? Because she wants, again, what is she trying to do? She's trying to say this is not the name of a deity because she doesn't want the practice of child sacrifice to originate outside Israel. She wants it to be part of the original Israelite Orthodox worship of Yahweh. Now, I don't know if Stavrokopoulou is motivated by her atheism. She is an atheist. I know one student who's a dissertator under her, and he's apparently having a good experience. Nothing personal about her here, but I just have to wonder if she doesn't have some kind of axe to grind. So, she recognizes this problem to her thesis that everywhere else this syntactical construction refers to a deity name and not to a particular sacrifice. And so she offers a few possible comebacks to this problem. I think only one of them is really worth mentioning, that you might have a point here. So back to Durrell, he's going through these, and this is one of them. He writes, it is possible that ha-molech, and it's vocalized there, so the ha definite article plus the MLK, refers not to the ritual but to the sacrificial victim himself, not the deity. Remember, she doesn't want to say it's a deity from the outside. She's saying, well, maybe the MLK doesn't refer to a ritual, but it refers to the victim. Thus, the Hebrew phrase to whore after the MLK would be referring to whoring after the MLK offerings and not the deity. Well, is she trying to say, now she doesn't say this, but is she trying to say that they were whoring after these things because they just liked to kill people? Maybe they didn't like the victims. They just wanted to see certain people be victims. I don't really know where she's going with this, but to me, that doesn't undermine the syntactical problem her view is facing. She's still trying to make it about the offering. And she says, well, the victim, that could be viewed sort of as a proper. No, look, again, I don't really know what her angle is here, but it doesn't feel too effective. But this is probably the best of the ones that Durrell goes to. The other ones just are worse. Okay, back to Durrell. Finally, she notes that the fact that MLK offerings were mentioned in conjunction with ancestral gods, the Ovot, we've talked about the Ovot here in the podcast before, the Ha-Ovot and the knowers, the Ha-Yidei, the knowing ones, okay? And she cites Leviticus 20 verses 2 through 5. So again, she says, well, the Ovot and the knowing ones appear to have played a role in divinatory practice, as does the MLK offering. That might be why people are doing it. Again, that doesn't help her case. That doesn't help her get away necessarily from the outside origin. Because, number one, the Ovot and the knowing ones are still entities. Of course, you would do this in a divinatory ritual, because it's the entities on the other side that you presume have knowledge that you want, or that you want to placate them. So, okay, it's not about Molech, it's about some other entities. What's the point? I mean, really, what's the point? Because those practices specifically are condemned in the Hebrew Bible because they are offerings, sacrifices to other deities. So I don't know, again, how she thinks this works, but I'm just saying it really doesn't. Again, it doesn't get her far enough away from the thing that she's trying to get away from in making this argument. Now, back to Durrell, Stavrokopoulou does not attempt to demonstrate that any of these options, and I've only hit a couple here. She doesn't try to demonstrate that any of these options is the correct one, but she concludes that there's enough reason to doubt that the verse absolutely precludes an understanding of MLK as a type of offering rather than the full name of a deity. If I was on her dissertation committee, I would say, you just have not made that case. Because these are still entities. It doesn't matter that it's a deity name, they're still deities. Even if Ovot and the knowing ones, the Yidaoni, aren't proper names, they're still entities. So you really haven't gotten away from this very far. And again, the other issue about whoring after the victim, I don't know what the point is there. So again, if I was her advisor for her dissertation, I would have said, man, it's not like I'm going to flunk you or anything, because you don't do that sort of thing unless you're a jerk. But I'd say this just really isn't satisfying. It's just not cutting it. Anyway, the issue for Stavrokopoulou is that she takes the law of the firstborn as being a viable option for people in early Israel. This is really what she's trying to go after. And so when Durrell sort of gets around his own assessment of what she's trying to do, let me just quote a little bit more from him, then we'll be done with the dissertation. We're almost actually, we're close to wrapping up here anyway, because this is kind of the point I wanted to angle for. The recent work. And even if you can't pronounce Stavrokopoulou, you'll see her name on the internet, because again, her name gets picked up as a biblical scholar who's into this topic, and she has an axe to grind. Okay, she thinks that the prohibitions of this are just propaganda. She operates with a hermeneutic of suspicion. That's what she's doing. But Durrell, again, let's just go back to him to wrap up. This does not mean, Durrell says, that Stavrokopoulou believes there were some groups who adhered to a law that called for the general sacrifice of firstborn children and others do not. He's talking about how she says it's an option. Instead, she agrees with DeVoe that firstborn sacrifice is unlikely. So she actually agrees with DeVoe that, it's unlikely this was institutionalized. It's unlikely to have been generally practiced even by an isolated group. Although she disagrees with his conclusion that the laws that seem to command precisely that must mean something different. Instead, she argues that DeVoe misunderstands the nature of the biblical laws, which is a real mouthful. Roland DeVoe had real high status as a biblical scholar, and you got to have more than what you have to just dismiss DeVoe. Like, he just doesn't get it. So that would leave me a little dissatisfied as well. Now, in his Exodus commentary, Prop, this is Durrell again pointing out that Prop, the Exodus commentary in the Anchor Yale Bible series, also argues against interpreting Exodus 22, 28, and 29, and some of these other passages as indicating that firstborn children were ever regularly offered by Israelite Yahweh. So again, DeVoe and Prop, they're not evangelicals. I think that's important to point out. This is mainstream biblical scholarship. Again, the people who are like Stavrokopoulou, they're on the periphery of this issue, thinking that it was institutionalized. And again, to be fair to Stavrokopoulou, she does back off of that a little bit and says, well, maybe it was an option. They could kill the kid if they want. If not, they could redeem it later on. But initially, she would be firm here. Initially, the beginning of the worship of Yahweh, child sacrifice was a normal institution. She would say that. But DeVoe disagreed with that. Prop disagreed with that. Others, of course, have disagreed with that. Prop has kind of a funny line in here in his Exodus commentary. He points to really the absurd logic of this. He refers to an institutionalized child sacrifice as being Darwinian suicide on the part of Israelites, which, if everybody's doing this, that's kind of going to hurt the population. How would you explain, again, the expansion of the population? Again, somebody like Stavrokopoulou could just come along and say, the Bible's full of it. The population didn't expand, they struggled, until they reached enlightenment. Maybe this was their point of enlightenment. Say, hey, our population's not growing. We're heading into demographic winter here. We better stop this. Again, it's just speculation. Now, Durrell winds up this way. He says, those who argue that the plain sense of Deuteronomy 22, 28, and 29, along with Exodus 13, 1 and 2, okay, if you view those as originally separate from verses 11 through 16, so if you're one that says verses 11 through 16 were added later, and all you've got is Exodus 13, 1 and 2, and Exodus 22, 28, 9, well, then, you'd have to read those verses, and there'd be no reason to not conclude that Yahweh was asking for child sacrifice. Because when you eliminate the redemption part of the passage, what else do you have? It would be easy to read it that way. So Durrell's saying, if you take that stuff out, well, then, that's what you'd have. And then he says, further, the fact that animals are said to be offered in the same way makes it highly unlikely that firstborn children are intended to be dedicated to temple service rather than sacrifice. And here I'll break in and say, Durrell misses the verse 13, because there is an exemption that applies to firstborn donkeys. And yes, I know he's saying, if you add the verses 11 through 16 later and you just, you don't even look at that, I agree. If you're not looking at those verses, then how else would you read these passages? But then he tries to make part of the argument on the redemption idea, which is in those verses. And he misses the firstborn donkey thing, which, as I said earlier, really messes up the logic. What? The prophets were so offended by firstborn donkey sacrifice, they had to put in a redemption clause here? Again, it's kind of silly. Durrell says, despite the plain sense of the text, however, scholars are right to question how the obvious reading can be the correct one, given the overwhelming evidence that firstborn children were not regularly sacrificed. While a full diachronic examination will have to wait until the following chapters, he does that in his dissertation. It is worth noting that there is no indication in any of the copious narrative material of the Hebrew Bible that firstborn children were ever regularly sacrificed by the Israelites or their neighbors. The cases of child sacrifice that do appear are all during extraordinary circumstances. The sole exception is Ezekiel 20 and verse 25, which appears to imply that at least some Israelites were interpreting some law as demanding a child sacrifice. Ezekiel 20:25 says, moreover, I gave them statutes that were not good and rules by which they could not have life, and defiled them through their very gifts and their offering of all their firstborn, and I might devastate them. Again, does that refer to the animals? Does it refer to people? Or is it just a terrible interpretation of a law like Exodus 13, 1 and 2? We don't really know. Ezekiel's not that specific. Now, I would agree with Durrell in this respect. The absence of evidence for the practice, the institutionalized practice of child sacrifice, argues pretty forcefully that the true worship of Yahweh did not include child sacrifice. You got to have some positive evidence that they were doing this, that they were looking at the text the way Stavrokopoulou looks at it, Okay, you got to have something there, because if you don't, you have circular reasoning. That's what you have. At the end of the day, that is what you have. I would also agree with Prop that this is kind of a Darwinian national suicide sort of thing. And again, I would further go back to how this makes zero sense as a remembrance of the protection of the firstborn. That's its context. The Passover is the context for Exodus 13, 1 and 2, even without verses 11 through 16. And again, I don't think there's any evidence that verses 11 through 16 weren't there when verses 1 and 2 were written. Again, I think that's pure speculation. But even if they weren't there, think about it. Exodus 13, 1 through 2 come on the heels of Exodus 12, the protection of the firstborn at the Passover. So how in the world does it make any sense to say, hey, the Lord just protected our firstborn, now let's kill it, or he wants us to kill it now? Again, I think that's a logical absurdity, even without verses 11 through 16. Let me end by offering my own speculation here, though. I mean, see if again, I think, yeah, I'm doing what these other people do on the other side of it. So yeah, this is just speculation, but I think this rings truer. I would suggest that there would have been people in Israel who thought that Exodus 13, 1 through 2, presuming they knew of it, and they were just sort of ignorant about everything else. Maybe there's somebody in Israel that thought those verses gave them permission to sacrifice a child to Yahweh. Let's just say somebody would have just been that dense and would have done that. Sure, somebody could have used the verses we've talked about to justify the idea, presuming, again, incorrectly, that was how Yahweh wanted to be worshipped. Sort of like, how some people in Israelite history thought that other aberrant forms of worship were fine. Remember 2 Kings 23, 10 to 11, you have sun worship. Josiah's reform, that's the same context, like 2 Kings 23. There were other people doing other things, thinking that it was okay worship of Yahweh, but they were wrong. We might be generous and call these sorts of assumptions understandable, but they'd still be wrong. Maybe they looked at it or heard the verse, oh, okay, I could offer my kid, and maybe that God will love me a little bit more. Again, this isn't good thinking, but you could see where somebody would think this way. Again, we might be generous and just say, well, they were just kind of clueless, they weren't evil, but they were clueless, or something like that. But if the verses were evident, there'd have been an institutionalized child sacrifice, and you'd think there would be either textual or archaeological evidence in Israel for that, and there is neither. I would say it's sort of similar to how some Christians today, people who embrace the work of the cross, and they don't believe there's another way of salvation, they're really Christians. They might use Exodus 21, 22 through 25 to justify abortion. Okay, let me just read the passage to you. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, and there is no harm, but the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. So the idea here, again, in some quote unquote, I hate the term progressive Christians, legitimize abortion on the basis of this passage. They again, it's going to sound a little bizarre maybe to some of you, but some of you may have come across this, but they'll make the passage say that you only have the eye for eye, the death penalty offense, if the woman is killed. But if the kids die, they come out and they presume that they're stillborn or something, then you don't have the death penalty. And so that means that the child, the fetus, was not viewed as human, whereas the woman was. So we can, abortion's okay. Maybe there are Christians, and I know there are Christians today, that would look at that passage, interpret it that way, and justify an abortion. They would be wrong as well, just like our hypothetical person in Israel that looks at Exodus 13, 1 through 2 and says, oh, okay, I can sacrifice my kid. Okay, yeah, you can see how people can reach a conclusion, but they'd still be wrong. And we know in the instance of Exodus 21, 22 through 25, the abortion passage, we know that they're wrong for certain, because when we juxtapose that passage to the very similar legislation in Hammurabi's law, we learn that the difference in fines, difference in penalties, is about social class, not something is human versus not human. So we need to get it in our heads that just because an Israelite, or maybe a bunch of Israelites, had a thought, just because they have a thought, doesn't mean the thought was correct. And it also doesn't mean that it was an institutionalized thought. Lots of people in ancient Israel, another example, thought Yahweh had a consort, a wife, Asherah. We know that's the case from sites and inscriptions like Kuntalet Ajrud and Kirbet El-Kam, where you have a reference to Yahweh and his Asherah. Okay, some Israelite out there somewhere in the boonies, okay, believe that. But going from that observation, somebody thought that way, to saying that Orthodox Yahwism included the idea Yahweh had a wife, that's flawed. That's flawed reasoning. There's no evidence in the Hebrew Bible that this was the case and that it was institutionalized. It's only when the hermeneutic of suspicion is applied do we see such arguments arise, and their conclusions are non sequiturs. They go like this. Well, let's take the Asherah one. Well, the prophets railed against Asherah, so that must mean Asherah used to be Yahweh's wife, and that was okay until the prophets. That's a non sequitur. I harken back once again, you've heard me mention this before, to the day in my doctoral seminar at Wisconsin when I said it would be a good idea if a logic course was required of all doctoral students in biblical studies. Okay, I didn't win hearts and minds that day, but I meant it then, and I mean it now. Okay, clear thinking is kind of important. So with respect to Exodus 13, what we're left with is the biblical data as they stand versus speculative moving parts of passages around chronologically to accommodate a hermeneutic of suspicion that wants to take the condemnations of child sacrifice as indicating a former allowed practice, and then use the moving of those passages around as a proof. It's circular reasoning, and it's a self-serving approach.